Good morning, everyone. So yeah, we are recording, particularly for speakers coming in, and hopefully we'll have Rick Dyer joining us shortly as well. So we'll keep an eye out for him. And we do record these sessions so that they can be loaded onto the website and people can refer to them afterwards. So thanks so much for joining. Hi, Nancy. We have two great speakers today that we'll be hearing from shortly. Drew Pearson from Blue Wave Solar, speaking about dual siting conditions, and Rick Dyer from Monmouth to talk about his experience with solar on his farm. But before we get going, just want to check in with the co-chairs, see if you have anything that you want to say before we review the agenda.
No, good morning. I think we've got a robust agenda and excited to tackle it.
I agree. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So I just want to check in about timeline here. We've got, we're in October. We have a report due at the end of the calendar year. And so we have this meeting and two other meetings remaining. The following two meetings are on November 18th and December 16th. So I think in an ideal world, you'd be coming out of today's meeting largely knowing what you would want included in that final report, details notwithstanding. You'd have, certainly one more opportunity to mess around the edges with additional with additions to it. But in an ideal world, you're leaving today's meeting pretty clear on what major policy recommendations or content you want in that report. So I just want you to be keeping that in mind as you're hearing presentations and as you're having discussions about both the matrix and the policy document and anything else that we're talking about. You also should have received a couple of days ago a draft outline for a report, just giving you high-level categories and wanting to make sure that we get your feedback as to whether there are major components that you think are missing or just aren't logically structured in there. So please feel free to ask questions about that, and we'll dig into that later. Morning, Rick. Glad you could join us.
Hello.
And Jeremy as well, and Emily. So with that, any questions about what we're covering today before we dig into our first speaker? All right. Okay. So Drew Pearson, Blue Wave Solar, I will let you introduce yourself. If you would, you'll do a better job than I will. And the group's excited to hear about dual use considerations.
Great. Hey, everybody. Want to thank everyone here for having me and honestly for your interest in having this discussion. It's a really exciting time to be reimagining what solar can look like because of how many intersections it has with so many fundamental aspects of our planet and economy. So from that standpoint, I've been leading our company's efforts for the last 4 or so years on everything agrivoltaics and dual use. I've been directly developing projects at Blue Wave for just over 7. So I come at this work as a project developer. I come at this work as someone trained in city and regional planning, through graduate school, big interest in rural development, land management, innovation networks, knowledge-driven economic development. And then also another hat I wear is someone who's interested in environmental markets. I worked in the rec market for a long time, doing green power marketing, helping to connect consumers with renewable energy projects. And so I think I'd like to encourage everyone to kind of keep a lot of these hats sort of like in mind as we talk about this, because it'll hopefully better, sort of convey where I'm coming from and some of the opportunities that I see. So that said, today we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to develop dual use and specifically agrivoltaics. What are some of the cost drivers? And then recognizing some of the just constraints in Maine, like what does that mean about what opportunities could be pursued given conditions in Maine? And for me, I'm personally excited because I think that your state has a big opportunity to demonstrate something different. And so that said, I can just kind of get into it and we'll go from there. Great. So bring this up. All right. Do folks see my screen?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, great. So, Blue Wave was founded in 2011. So we've been around a bit in solar years, with the mission of revolutionizing energy. I think that we're a company with a strong vision, and we're committed to obviously, protecting the planet, but I think, to an ethos of like really experimenting and leading by doing and helping the industry connect dots. And that's very much, how we approach this work. And I know, Caitlin, I see your hand is up. I don't know if you wanted to say something.
I'm good. Sorry, Drew.
Okay, no worries. No worries. So we were really active in the early days, redeveloping contaminated lands. We were founded by the former New England EPA administrator, John DeVillers. And ever since, he and many of us have very much pushed on, again, this idea of innovation and experimentation. And so that really brings us to why we're here today. Much of this is obviously familiar to everyone here, but it's no secret that solar is getting rapidly deployed as clean energy goals ramp up, and that's taking up significant portions of farmland where it's typically easier and cheaper to build. Interconnection costs and the ability to interconnect is a big driver of siting. So, the argument of whether it's rooftops or carports or whatever it is also, somewhat sidelined, because at the end of the day, the grid will be able to accommodate, projects primarily in rural areas. And so rather than putting these uses at odds with each other, we've really tried to figure out how they can coexist. And so this has resulted in this sort of philosophy that we call dual use that encompasses a variety of land uses. A lot of text here, and I just hope that it's a good resource for everyone after the presentation. So obviously not going to read through everything, but I think that the big point here for us is that dual use is an opportunity to focus on complementary land uses that weave together, focus on ecosystem services, agricultural vitality. And we hope that by doing that, it sets the table for holistic community development. The land piece is important. Once we get that right, then the question is, what can we do once we get that right? And so I wanted to frame today's discussion really, first is as a function of like, what should we be asking ourselves and each other? It's like, what do we want, right? And assuming that's clean energy, we would all probably agree farmland loss is bad, economic disparities are bad, health disparities are bad, and lack of access to healthy food is bad. So conversely, all of the opposites are, I would assume, good, right? Farmland preservation, economic opportunity, healthy communities, and access to food. So if we can agree that those are good things that we want, let's start there. Because then the question I think that we should be asking ourselves today is, how do we get there together, recognizing the constraints in Maine? It's no secret to anyone here that the prospect of a dual use incentive is potentially pretty unlikely. So this now becomes a discussion philosophically between regulatory mechanisms at our disposal versus voluntary approaches. And I honestly, in my personal opinion, think that Maine has a golden opportunity to demonstrate how a voluntary dual use market could function and what it could look like. So I just wanted to encourage everyone to kind of keep that thought in mind. Again, that's my personal opinion as we go through, but I think it'll really help frame this very important question, which everyone should be asking, is how can I help? What is my role? And that's what I'm hoping to sort of elucidate in this discussion today. And so why should we be interested? Like, it's here to stay. It's not going away. It works. And this is an opportunity for us to put new ideas into practice and really reach for goals that we want to realize. It's an opportunity to provide access to resources, new opportunities and partnerships for every stakeholder, including the farming community that's part of this, this industry. It's an opportunity to promote holistic rural development and really create like shared value that goes beyond the solar farm. Because again, we're talking about, yes, preserving farmland, but also creating opportunities for the next generation of farmers. And so we can be a part of a variety of different solutions here that are all important for, our own wellness, but also for the climate fight. And it's very clear that there's a growing interest in policy and different corners of the market. And there are a lot of collaborative networks forming to advance dual use that I think Maine can benefit from. And so as a city planner and regional planner, for me, this is like, this is analogous to, the evolution of like 1960s style single use suburban development, now sort of like trying to change its course and create room for more mixed uses. So it's a more efficient use of space, sure, but like it's better for society in so many other ways, right? We're doing the same thing in the rural development context. And so, yes, we can have people telling us or requiring us to do it, but I think we can also pursue it because it's just simply inherently good and it's something we want. And so I think in the latter, that is going to, I think, enable a lot of hopefully creativity that, when no one's telling us what to do and we can do what we want, it's wide open. And so now this is a conversation about how do we bring our sectors together to simply have that starting conversation and then figure out, how we can advance it. So to go through what dual use is, we're talking about combining, a land management philosophy or a variety of philosophies rooted in conservation and agriculture to create a multifunctional system that's benefiting across the board. So pollinator friendly, very familiar to everybody, pretty self-explanatory, right? But it's setting the course for stabilizing soil, creating good ecological value for hydrology, for building soil, for biodiversity. And then that kind of setting the table for grazing solar, which is effectively just supplementing or replacing mowing with sheep. And that can be done in a way that also builds soil and creates virtuous cycles. And then agrivoltaics, creating room for crops, creating room for the mobility of people and equipment. But then all of this being done with a focus on enhancing ecosystem services on site. And then even thinking about what would an ecological management plan look like that, yes, is focused on site, but then on the periphery. And then I would like to encourage everyone to think like, okay, what could offsite conservation benefits look like when we're building that into the sort of model of how we're selling our electricity? If we're cutting trees here, is it possible we could preserve trees here? That's, I think, a very, very simple way to look at it. But again, as a developer, this is a question that's been on many of our minds for many years. So I think the basic point of this slide is really just to remind everyone that we can go further together when we're working together. And that, when we're convening our sectors, this is about collective problem solving. And I would like to encourage folks to think about value chains that are connected to a farm, to a sheep grazing economy, to the solar economy. Like, how do we create value across those different chains that intersect at a project? And so with that sort of in mind, like, how would we define shared goals about realizing benefits across those value chains? And so for us, I think focusing on the opportunity for well-crafted partnerships that involve a variety of different people from all sectors, I think is really key to realizing those goals. And that's going to take a variety of different forms depending on where you are and what you're trying to do. But I think that, again, we're bringing people from different disciplines and sectors of the economy together in the spirit of collaboration, then anything is possible. And so I think the last part of this slide is really just to sort of set the tone for what a continuous open dialogue and process of refinement could look like once, ideas are put into practice, people are evaluating results, and then trying to inform, again, how you can improve based on what you're observing. And this is a long time. Projects are going to be around for 20 plus years. So I hope we can all appreciate that even if we don't get it right today, we can improve throughout that time. So dual use is really, it's about steering solar and farming toward a climate, ecology, and people-centered ethos. It's about helping farmers expand production and stack benefits in ways that improve their livelihoods. We want to encourage the solar industry to demonstrate best practices for developing on farmland. And then, I think that the scale of projects and portfolios can drive innovation in ways that's going to involve everybody and contribute a ton of new knowledge to all sides of this equation when we can set the course with that in mind. So specifically on agrivoltaics, you may have seen this image before, but again, this is from Fraunhofer out of Germany. They've been a leader in this space for well over a decade. It's really just about achieving more with the same land. Let's think about how we can simply combine these uses again in ways that are better than each use standing on its own. And I'll have more case studies later in the slides that can help sort of unpack how that is getting done. But that said, we've really thought about like how we can advance agrivoltaics from the point of siting through operation. And I think a couple of important points here I'd like to just highlight going down the list. So I think first on siting, recognizing that you got a fixed amount of farmland to a point. Let's preserve it, let's protect it. Regardless of what level of dual use one is thinking about, if solar is being sited on farmland, that soil should be managed in a way that's preserving its vitality long-term. And then I think it's also about respecting the agricultural context of a place and the history of agriculture in that surrounding community. And so on the design front, consultation with farmers, I think up front is really key to ensuring that the flexibility for farming throughout the project's life is preserved. And I think in Maine, there are any variety of ways that projects can be designed with real minimal impact on the fundamental viability of that project and profitability based on what we're seeing elsewhere. So I think then this really just becomes a simple question of tweaking, panel clearance, row width, and fencing clearance for equipment logistics. And then how do you put business agreements together that ensure that effectively farmers are welcome onto that site? And then again, how do we understand the growing conditions that are there? On construction, there's a lot of innovation that's happening because of our work in Massachusetts with the SMART program that to me is demonstrating that the construction community is up to the task to not only like respect farmland in a way that is minimally impactful, but also introduce new practices that will inherently supercharge that land's ability to recover and be well primed for the first growing season. And we can talk about that in follow-up conversations. And pairing that with farm infrastructure, then I think there's a lot of possibilities. On the maintenance side, I think that the O&M and insurance agreements need to be crafted and real estate agreements with farmers in mind to keep them on the property. And so we want to make sure that, if that's happening, farmers have an opportunity to influence what those agreements can look like. Because if we're not talking about mowing, then arguably growing crops is also maintaining vegetation. So they're providing both the service and they're benefiting from being, on the site. So it's just a new form of O&M. And so ensuring that there's really good communication and reporting protocols in place, I think is going to be important to make sure that there are no surprises down the line. And many community impacts certainly evident, but for me, one of the most exciting is that of education, training, and new employment for upcoming farmers. So there are many advantages, to agrivoltaic solar that research is unpacking that I think are very clear and evident. There are microclimate benefits that crops will have on by virtue of attenuated sunlight and heat stress and better moisture retention. It can also help protect crops through extreme weather events. Think hail or something similar, heat waves. So in turn, it's going to reduce the need for watering in many respects as everywhere effectively gets hotter and drier. And so by virtue of doing so, in stacking these benefits and providing a hedge and having supporting infrastructure on site for farmers, we're really talking about improving farm economics and viability. And so again, providing on-site water infrastructure for irrigation, fencing that is a big cost center, shelters or equipment, et cetera, like power supply. There are all sorts of ways solar projects can help farmers. There are risks, however. This is not all roses. There's a lot of, I think, new areas of uncertainty that farmers and solar developers will have to think through. I mean, farmers in some cases could be departing from long-held philosophies of how they farmed, using big booms, 30-foot wide pieces of equipment, et cetera. No longer possible in a solar project. How do we do that differently? How do we apply, pesticides or inputs in ways that aren't flying up onto the panels, right? Like there are low impact methods that may not have been on a farmer's mind before that are now actually required because you don't want to damage the solar project. But I think the opportunity here is that low impact agriculture in many ways is very good. So let's talk about that. But then I guess like the last piece is that, yeah, farmers are not going to get there on their own. They're going to need to invest in new equipment or even business models to figure out how this works within this new dimensional environment. But that's an achievable and manageable, challenge to overcome. So some of the challenges of agrivoltaics is moving from research to commercialization. I think that's the big question on many folks' minds, but we're already seeing that it's possible. And so, of course, winning over skeptics, really big challenge. And there's just a lot of moving parts. I think out of these many opportunities, like I mentioned, the synergies that I think you can find between the benefits of this new growing environment and helping farmers stabilize and diversify their sort of production profile, I think is really exciting. Because again, this is like almost like a deep intervention that like farmers are kind of in need of already, because in many cases it's razor thin margins and really difficult on their own. And so I think while we're making that intervention, thinking about climate positive agricultural practices like regenerative agriculture that sequester carbon, build soil, and improve hydrology is a fantastic opportunity for all of us to have in the front of our minds when we're talking about education and curriculum development for surrounding farmers. And that's like the kind of impact that I think solar can make. And that's why I think we belong in rural communities, because if we have that mentality, we're helping everyone advance the climate fight much more rapidly. And so that said, when we're telling that story and when we're achieving those results and we're getting consumers engaged, I would like to think consumers want that and they would pay for that. And I think that's kind of part of the conversation today is how do we unlock that consumer interest so that they're paying for it? And so that said, there's a variety of different design approaches that agrivoltaics could take. You have a variety of fixed tilt projects that could be standard height, elevated, spaced out panels. You can have trackers. So the top photo here is a cross section of Jack's solar garden in Colorado, 14-foot row spacing, 6 feet high. I have a few pictures later that's going to take this bare field and I think create a very different impression. Dual axis trackers, another great way to think about space efficient, highly productive ways of developing solar. And then in Europe, we're seeing elevated single axis trackers, and in Massachusetts, us and other developers are going to be doing these types of projects in response to the SMART program. And all said, I think like there are many opportunities to think about how the design typology creates opportunity to improve the growing environment. And that could look different depending on your design. And then lastly, there are all sorts of novel approaches that people are taking, panels that will shift on tracks. In this middle photo, that is a depiction of an orchard with basically a dual eaved sort of fixed tilt project that is facing both east and west to approximate what a tracker would do. I think it's very interesting. And then at the bottom, there's just vertical solar fencing, again, with an east-west orientation. So again, there's any variety of different design approaches that can be adopted depending on your agricultural goals and the ultimate cost and efficacy of doing it. So on the domestic level, I'd like to point you all to this photo at the top right. This is the photo of Jack's solar garden. One of our agricultural partners took on a site visit earlier this year. They're just getting started with their first growing season, or I guess now finishing their first growing season. And there are a few other photos, we can go through, but to me, seeing this is incredibly exciting because this is a farm, and this is very different than site coverage we're typically used to seeing. So from that standpoint, I'm going to jump ahead. I think that project is nationally significant because it's now proving to me that we can get this done within standard single axis tracker designs. But at the top, we've got a lot of federal networks focused on public-private research, looking at all elements of agrivoltaic design and efficacy. And in the case of the Department of Energy, Blue Wave, American Farmland Trust, UMass, and others, we've been involved in a interdisciplinary partnership focused on unpacking the growing environment of agrivoltaics, focused on crop trials, and focused on measuring how land is responding to regenerative practices. And we're hopeful that that sort of interdisciplinary view will both inform best practices, but another piece of the study is going to be looking at on-farm economics. How is the farm doing effectively as a result of dual use? And so networks like that, I think, are going to be really important for places like Maine, and Maine can contribute. So to that end, in New Jersey, there's a bill passed earlier this year that we're really excited about, authorizing 200 megawatts of a pilot program, and those rules are still under development. And in New York, NYSERDA released, I think, a really encouraging sort of model for many places to consider, but it's effectively a scorecard, sort of looking at the hierarchy of different outcomes that could be achieved with agrivoltaics and dual use. And I think, again, as we could discuss later, that can be a useful way to think about how a voluntary or other type of market might look like. So for Blue Wave, we've had the benefit of doing kind of both types of projects. We did our first agrivoltaic project in Maine on a voluntary basis. There's no incentive, but we felt strongly that this was the right tone to set in entering this market based on our experience in Massachusetts. So what we did is we built a standard project, fixed tilt on a blueberry patch. And the farmer actually knew about our experience in Massachusetts with dual use and said, I'll only sign up with you if I can continue farming these blueberries. And we said, okay, sure, we'll figure it out. So what we're doing is, in this 10-acre project, we're hosting a crop trial over the over half of that site, where University of Maine is going to be looking at the impacts of construction practices on the existing blueberry bushes. And as you see in that photo, we laid some plywood down to protect those blueberries from equipment that we're driving over to install the racks and the panels, et cetera. And recognizing that construction practices come with costs, we want to get a sense of, like, what does it take a blueberry, bush 1 year, 2 years, 3 years to recover from these variety of different construction practices. And so the blueberry specialist, Dr. Lily Calderwood, within the extension, will be researching that with her team. They'll also be measuring the growing environment, the environmental conditions, and then looking at the physiological responses of blueberries to this new environment. We have a partnering farmer who has been, or grower rather, who's been doing this for many years, and with the assistance of basically a stipend and equipment investment that will enable him to miniaturize his cultivation practices on an ATV and allow him to be more nimble in navigating through this array. We're really excited that this is going to be a really useful trial. It's going to be 5 years, and so it'll have bifacial panels, and we'll see how it goes. In Grafton, in Massachusetts, this is a very different design, which is elevated, has spaced out panels, and an alternative azimuth. And this is done, as a function of the SMART program. It's going to be hosting research, ground crops, and rotational grazing of cows for beef. We're building on-site infrastructure, including water, an irrigation system, an animal shelter, and fencing to facilitate the operation. And again, this is going to be looked at with an interdisciplinary lens. On the international scale, I'm really excited because there are unequivocal examples worldwide that show that this is not only doable and it works, but is rapidly scaling. Japan's been doing agrivoltaics since 2004. They have over 2,000 projects across the country, now growing 120 plus kinds of crops. And it's now the preferred national siting policy for Japan on prime farmland. So standard solar, forget it. They want to see agrivoltaics. So in my mind, this is about as good of an example as one could hope for. But a lot going on with Germany in terms of their crop trials and research, which I would encourage everyone to look up if you haven't already, with Fraunhofer. And France is really interesting because the open energy market is responding to competitive bids with agrivoltaic projects. So effectively what companies are doing is they're figuring out how to leverage the design of their solar project to benefit growing conditions for, in this case, vineyards and orchards. They're providing enough value in crop protection and hedging against bad conditions where farmers are like, yeah, I'm there. And they're bidding into the open market at competitive prices. And they're doing this on a large scale. I think there was about an 80 megawatt slug that won a contract for under 10 cents a kilowatt hour, in France. And so again, this is a rapidly maturing market. And so it's not going to go away. So how do we leverage that? And I guess the other examples I think are interesting. In Spain, utilities are developing projects with standardized crop plans. So what foods are highly consumed in Spain? What's the ideal farm plan to pair with a project that it's basically profitable, it's scalable, and it's locally relevant? And I think those are three things that we should keep in our mind as we talk about what options are available to us in Maine. So to move to our sort of second agrivoltaic effort in Maine, I wanted to give everyone a little bit of a preview into an ongoing effort. We have a project in Benton that is still under development. And our hope is to repeat the model that we outlined in Rockport with blueberries, almost in a way that's like Jack's Solar Garden. We have about a 32-acre site. We want to dedicate 5 acres of that to a crop trial that would basically invite farmers to engage and to experiment and to test and demonstrate viable farm plans. We've got a nominal budget set aside to support them in the form of a stipend and in the form of on-site water infrastructure. We're also ensuring that the fence clearance on either side of the panels will allow for equipment logistics. We're looking at things like site civil and stormwater management in consultation with the Maine DEP to ensure that, so we have 2 uses proposed on this site. The 27 acres focused on sheep grazing, 5 acres focused on ground crops. So keeping these uses sort of separate, you don't want sheep pooping on your crops, like thinking about that internal sort of separation, what does that best practice look like? And with all of this in mind, we're hopeful that we can create an on-ramp for a farmer who is willing to test and demonstrate what a profitable and scalable farm plan could look like within an agrivoltaic growing environment. That's a single axis tracker. It's going to be spaced at anywhere from 16 to 20 feet apart at a similar height. Let's just call it 6 feet or so as Jack's Solar Garden. And I think the benefit of a single axis tracker is that there are going to be points where that panel, let's say, is 3 feet off the ground on one side of the aisle, but as it tilts, it could be as high as 9 feet. So we're kind of approximating the benefit of having a raised canopy, but with just a raised panel. So what does that operational model look like? Is there a way you can optimize that tracking algorithm or optimize the sort of logistics of when and where farming is taking place so that basically those dynamics are respected? And so our hope is that we can recruit long-term partners who are really interested in supporting the demonstration of what a viable farm plan can look like in Maine. And we want to market these outcomes to the general public. So this is just a little bit of a preview on how we're thinking about segmenting this. A lot of the sort of conditions are outlined here, and just recognizing time. we've got flyer that you saw in the packet and we're basically hoping to continue networking and discussing opportunities with the local farming community. But I want to take a step back and just articulate, like, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think an ideal partner, hypothetically, could be someone with established reputation, a locally important company with a big role in the agricultural community. So take someone like Johnny Select Seeds. They've been around in Maine for a long time. They sell seeds nationally. They have a seed division. They have a farm equipment division. What does an R&D crop trial look like for a company interested in entering the agrivoltaic space from that angle? What happens when a company's focused on cultivating crop varieties specifically well-tuned for an agrivoltaic environment? They can leverage that to develop products and standardized farm plans, or support the development of standardized farm plans that are locally relevant and have high value. And there's a point where that's increasing competitive advantage in Maine. And is that an export? Who knows? But I think it's those kinds of opportunities, again, as a planner, that I want to sort of, on this last slide, sort of invite everyone to think about. Because I think, again, when we're approaching this with the question on our minds of what do we want and how can I help, then how we get there hopefully is pretty self-evident. And so this is really more of a reference slide for follow-up, but what I've tried to do is basically, organize what are just standard solar cost drivers. And then once we're thinking about agrivoltaics, what cost categories are specific to the solar project? What categories are specific to the farming operation? And this is not to say that the farmer should be burdened with all of the costs for farming, but this is, really, I hope, a way to illustrate how those costs can be sort of allocated on either side of the equation. And so that said, I think this yellow column to me is really where I hope the follow-on discussion can go. What are the ideas that we really think could be actionable in Maine? Certainly there are local bylaws and siting requirements, and even maybe permitting efficiencies that could be achieved when agencies are coordinated and collaborated. Nancy, I know that you're on the line. Our work to advance a solar grazing standard, it was really encouraging to me. It took some elbow grease, but we've now got a pilot going with the grazer focused on soil building practices that hopefully could set the standard for a DEP guideline that could influence how solar grazing happens across the industry. And that only happened because we wanted it, and we wanted to work together to talk it through. So from my standpoint, when we can repeat those, we can continue hitting singles and doubles, we're going to score some runs. So let's keep doing it. And so that's stated. When we can get those out of, sort of addressed, how can then pilot initiatives take off more easily? So yes, we talked about this crop trial in Benton, but this could arguably happen on any single axis tracker project anywhere in Maine. How might we collectively think about strategic farm plans that are locally relevant, profitable, and scalable? And how can we act on those in a way that helps farmers wrap their heads more easily around the risk that they would be taking to engage in this? Because my hope is that if a farmer understands it and they know they can do it, do they really need a subsidy? Maybe they just need a welcome mat. And that's kind of the third bullet. If we can design solar projects with a bare minimum set of standards that simply ensure that farmers are allowed on the property according to a certain set of conditions, that the project has been designed to accommodate farming should it occur, how do we market a network of projects that meet that standard? And I think that's kind of how a voluntary approach could start, but I also think it will rapidly surpass the limits of a regulatory program once that is well understood and consumers get it, and they're like, oh my God, this can be a part of how we engage electricity. Like, I think then that's going to provide a ton of momentum that will just simply propel itself. And I think when supported with ideas like a scorecard, like we're seeing in NYSERDA, Then the question becomes, if I'm a large anchor institution and I'm buying a ton of solar, and someone told me that if I had a 5% savings instead of 10% savings in exchange for supporting a farm, maybe that's something I want to do because I want that. I like that. And when that outcome can be marketed, then I think the sky's the limit. So I think I'm proposing all of this because all we need are a few people in Maine to raise their hands and say, yep, I'll do that. I'll test that. I'll demonstrate that. And I'll help the market understand it. Like that's, I think, the opportunity that we have. And when supported through the economic development planning community, now we can talk about, well, when we're getting these pilot projects done, it's really to what end? Like, where is it going and who is impacting? And how does this align with pre-existing economic development plans and frameworks we're already trying to advance? Everyone's focused on food systems and farming viability, et cetera, already across the board. So we're just simply plugging into that momentum. And there are a ton of networks and stakeholders nationwide that are ready to support this process. And I've done my best to list a ton on the right. But I guess all that said, hopefully I didn't take too much time. But for me, this is a really exciting conversation because, again, no one's doing this. No one's thinking this way. Maine can. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Drew. A ton of information that I'm sure the group will want to talk about. If you stop sharing your slides, we'll be able to see one another better. And then I will just open it up for both questions and comments from the group. For Drew. Go ahead, Ellen.
I have two questions, but I can just ask one and let others ask questions. But the first is, so you mentioned the NYSERDA scorecard and you mentioned New Jersey's pilot program, but I know you're kind of advocating for a voluntary approach, but in your opinion, looking at sort of different state policies, and I don't know what is present in Colorado, but are there sort of, policy tools that a state could implement that you think would really help to get more dual use projects kind of on the ground?
For sure. I'll put like the SMART program and the Massachusetts example aside because everyone's probably talked about that ad nauseum. In Colorado, it's a voluntary market, but there is the support of innovation grants that the state specifically is doling out to advance agrivoltaics. And that project that I mentioned, Jack Solar Garden, is supported by a variety of innovation grants from the federal level. I don't know if they have state grants, but I think the state basically saw that model and said, oh, that's a good idea. And they put their own together. So that's one. And then I think, otherwise, yeah, I mean, honestly, like the variety of ideas that we've mentioned, like, just amending bylaws, honestly, like in ways that it can at least encourage a bare minimum set of standards that are NRCS sort of approved, I think is a really good step. Because like pollinator and grazing solar arguably it's ready. Like, are you going to make every project a flowering, highly marketable garden? No, but you can still have part of that, but as well as, vegetation that still has high pollinating value that doubles as forage for sheep. And that's how we're trying to think at Blue Wave. And we've encouraged actually many permitting authorities we've worked with to also think in that way as well. Granted, it gets a little dicey when you've got a local bylaw trying to dictate or require an operational phase sort of activity, but I think that there are many ways to approach that simply through creative zoning. Yeah, so I guess that's really where I'll stop.
Thank you, Drew. Eliza.
Thanks, Joji, and thanks, Drew. That was a fantastic presentation. I'm really grateful for the creative work that Blue Wave's doing. And I think, Ellen and my mind were really in the same place, and how I was going to kind of pose the question, and this might take us in a slightly different direction, is, at the top of your presentation, you talked about you know, in your mind, the unlikeliness of incentives. And I really wanted to kind of press you on what, you know, in your mind, what incentives mean, because I feel like I also heard you say that you saw some real benefit in the New York scorecard and the New Jersey pilot program. You've now talked a little bit more about the Colorado Innovation Grant. In my mind, those are incentives. So I want to just be really careful about how we kind of use that word.
Yeah, thanks for the pushback and the clarification, or the request. So when I say incentive, I mean like rate-based per kilowatt hour, like smart, like Massachusetts style incentive that is rate-based, right, across the board for the entire market. So very well taken. When there's a budgetary constraint, okay, maybe it's not an entire market. Maybe we kind of reserve that for a select set of projects that meet a desired set of criteria in a spirit of demonstration. I think that's also an incentive, right? So, yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Drew. George, go right ahead.
I guess the question was partly comments as well. So I have 3 comments for approaches on this. Number one, I think the tax treatment on these types of projects should be agricultural current use. I think from a policy standpoint, we should find the most favorable tax treatment possible for these types of projects that enables and encourages their installation. Also, sort of from a policy standpoint within that context, I believe that in general, there would be a tremendous amount of support, probably statewide, for a tax treatment that enables these types of projects to successfully support family farms and Maine farms in general, most of which are family farmed anyways. And I don't think that people would necessarily see a downside to encouraging food production the way that these projects do. So I think that's really, really important. In a lot of other contexts in taxation and solar projects and that kind of thing, we certainly look at them as a tax opportunity. But if you have agrivoltaics that are really supporting food production, supporting small family farms, that is a really achieving a core goal of rural development, which is to encourage sustainability, long-term sustainability for family farms. So I don't know, Nancy might know better than me how to approach that on the tax side, but whatever absolutely the most favorable tax treatment that we can come up with on this is really probably fine by us, at least speaking, sort of trying or attempting to speak from a municipal standpoint. I'm not worried about collecting property taxes on solar panels that are supporting a family farm and encouraging their long-term sustainability. That's really, I think that's really important. And I think that overall, most rural communities would agree with that. I think that on these agrivoltaic projects, they should be given supportive funding for 3-phase extension if it's necessary. And I think that is potentially the component of this that could be ratepayer supported or government supported through clean energy investments in some way, shape, or form. I do think that's really important to think about. And then in tandem with that, I also think these types of projects should receive a priority treatment for interconnection and permitting. And I know Jeremy Payne may have a stroke at me mentioning changes to the interconnection queue and things like that. But this type of agrivoltaic approach, I think really we should consider how we do that. So those are 3 things: tax treatment, 3-phase extension, and priority treatment for interconnection and permitting. I think all 3 of those factors could make a significant difference. And I just wanted to throw that out there in terms of the policy side of things that we can do to help support these projects.
Great, thank you, George. Emily, go right ahead.
something first before I jump into a different question?
Nope. Go
Okay.
right ahead.
So I was hoping, Drew, you could speak for a moment around design of these agrivoltaic projects. You know, we know about Massachusetts and the incentive, the adder-based incentive, because of the significantly different requirements for the agrivoltaic projects there. But it looks like what you have in the works with the blueberry is not, you know, a ground-up redesign. It doesn't look a lot like Massachusetts. And so without, let's say there's an adder taken off the table here, could you speak to the real feasibility here for developers to move forward and redesign or adjust designs in terms of, you know, really the economic piece of this, making it work, making it not just, you know, added benefits that we sort of all want, right, around land conservation and protecting farmland, but sort of what's the nuts and bolts of the financials here? Can it work in Maine in terms of designing something that both fits economically, financially for developers and achieves these goals of farmland protection and continued farming?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Yeah, on that. So with fixed tilt designs, there are certainly approaches one can take to modify that environment that are available to developers. It's just more limited. But at least on fixed tilt, starting with bifacials, I think should just be like, that's just the assumption that gets done. But even on like the crop planting side, like there really does need to be like a very credible case and evidence that whatever is being proposed can adapt or thrive in a fairly shaded environment. In the case of blueberries, like we found a lot of research that basically said you could reduce, you know, the radiation to a blueberry by like as much of it as a third or more, and that crop is still going to do pretty much fine, and in some cases could benefit. The university agreed, and they said that's a really interesting question. Let's research that. And then I think tooling with the azimuth is really important too, because we want to open those aisles to the southern horizon more, so more of that direct sunlight is getting in. And in the case of Grafton, you know, going from true south to just say southeast was a hit to our energy yield of something like 5%, 5 or 6%. You know, I think, I mean, depending on the project, that could be acceptable. On single axis tracker, I think it's a pretty like straightforward exercise. I mean, effectively, the base design for a tracker is already virtually everything you need to start farming. Just control for row spacing, and maybe if you want to tweak height, great, and just make sure your fence is bumped out. You're kind of good to go. And then just George, want to thank you for bringing up taxes. That I don't even know why that was a blind spot I didn't even have on my slides, but I've definitely heard a lot of different creative ideas from different corners of the market. The impact of tax, I think, honestly, like on a large scale project, is in the millions of dollars when we're bifurcating the land valuation from the equipment valuation. And if that land valuation can retain some or all of that agricultural status, that could effectively take the place of an incentive, like for some projects. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, Drew. If anybody's looking at the agenda as I am and worried about the time, I just want you to know that I'm on top of it and have spoken with Caitlin, who's thinking that we probably don't need a half an hour fully on the matrix. We'll see. And Rick's available to stay on the line, which is great. Thank you, Rick. So I'm going to suggest we continue on with this conversation for a little bit longer and then pivot and see where we're at. And Drew, I guess I would check in with you as well as to your availability. It may not be needed. The group may not want it, but if they did, in terms of your later participation in this meeting to some extent, what's your availability?
Wide open.
Okay. All right. Great to know. All right. Thanks all. Ellen, go ahead.
Thanks so much. So I was wondering, George's comments started getting me thinking whether for the projects that you're doing in Maine, either in Rockport or in Benton, are there any sort of municipal permitting processes or solar ordinances in place in either of those municipalities that really encourages dual use from your perspective? Or are there municipal type ordinances that you think would be helpful?
Yeah, so I think starting with kind of construction processes, if you're on like prime farmland, you're going to have a building inspector coming out and checking off that list, right, to make sure that that project has met its requirements. And I think holding space for agriculturally compatible site establishment protocols. So maybe it's not like hydroseeding turf grass, maybe it's a cover crop, maybe it's straw, maybe you're actually like thinking about the sequencing of when land gets prepared to keep that soil top of mind. I think that if authorities could even lend some definition with the assistance of folks in the ag community to what those options are, it's going to make it easier for a developer to choose it. And so I think that's one way, to kind of to start. And then on like the siting, and at least in a regulated market, it's pretty straightforward. Like we've seen towns basically say, if you're going to be on prime farmland, you got to be dual use. But they also recognize that like it's an incentive program, and there are also different approaches to dual use. And so different towns are trying to find how, or basically ways like, okay, is that like pollinator and sheep, or is it just basically ensuring that like farming, is occurring? I think that the jury's still out on how best towns can sort of enforce approaches that seek to achieve those outcomes. But I absolutely would continue to encourage people to think about it. And I guess like on like the open space preservation side, like we haven't really talked a lot about conservation issues, but I think that if towns, for example, if you're in a forested area and the impact of tree cutting is large, I think that there is a reasonable threshold towns could set about if you're going to be cutting set amount of acreage, you got to make sure similar amounts of acreage are kept open in, maybe it's for the length of the project. I think that outside of, let's just say, a town requiring things, Emily and I have talked about this, but could there be a conservation easement that basically ensures that, yes, sure, solar can be here, but basically on the premise that farming is occurring within the site and like that's attached to the property or whatever it is, right? Like, and Emily, I think you might know that world a little better than I do, but I think that yeah, if it's for no other purpose than to encourage local actors to take those routes, towns can still be a very useful voice to influence those outcomes.
Great, thanks. So I think what I'm going to suggest is that we pivot at this point so that we can bring in information from Rick about his experience with decommissioning. We can assess afterwards, after the discussion about the matrix, where we're at before we go on break after public comment. So let's pivot. Thanks, Drew, so much for your presentation and also for your potential availability if the group thinks it would be helpful later on. Sure. So Rick, welcome. If you could introduce yourself about your farm. I know you're based in Monmouth, and we learned about you from Julianne. So Julianne, if you'd rather make a couple remarks first, you're welcome to do that, whatever you like.
Rick, I'll let you go ahead.
All right, great. So, and thanks everyone for letting me spend some time with you this morning. And Drew, thank you for your presentation. It was enlightening. And frankly, I'll admit and say that it would have been great if I'd known about you before I started some of my projects. So, so let me, and if you guys will bear with me for a sec, I'd like to, I guess, start with why did we start this project? And this farm has been in our family for approximately 115 to 120 years. It's in the fourth generation. And, so my goal, and let me back up one other point and say, I'm not the farmer. My uncle is the farmer, Jerry. And so I guess to a certain extent, you should think of me as a benevolent conservator of agricultural land. And I guess the first project would be Clemetto Farm. So why did I do a solar project is probably the first part, which was for long-term protection, which basically was so that when I'm gone, and whether that happens during this part of the solar project, but assume that potentially I'm not here, that from a taxation standpoint, the solar project would generate enough revenue so that even if my son, if he's helping to manage it, then all of the taxes on all of the property that I have up in Monmouth would be able to be kept open and conserved. And so it really became part of I'll say a portion of economic value that was rationalized so that a small portion was going to pay for the rest of the land to be kept open. And so, and I think, and I'm sure you guys all feel it, which is, frankly, in most communities, the largest conservators of open space are the farmers. So, but yet these farmers, my farm included, under immense pressure from the economics of the farming, both in Maine and the competition as it relates to farms across the country. And probably from a certain standpoint, the farms in Maine are no different than some others in other parts of the country, but certainly the economic pressure is immense. So, so that's the background of why I did it. And I'm going to give one other little bit for this group, and that I'll get to, I guess, why you guys asked me here, which is that I think for me anyway, as we worked our way through trying to get this approved in order to accomplish those economic values to protect the land, it was painful. And I'll say it was painful at a local administration level. They wanted to challenge it. And frankly, I suggest that, and maybe you guys have done it, I appreciate that this is the first time I'm here, but there almost needs to be documented legal and legislative support of the farmers to use the land as they see fit. We struggled with, the neighbors in the town and the town select people really trying to say that they wanted to play a role in that. And yet, and in Monmouth, I think now I am the largest landowner and have over 1,000 acres. So, but there really isn't any other incentive coming from the town to keep it open. So it's relied on me for the last 20 years to keep it open. And it was really frustrating, I'll say, at a administrative level to see that, the town or people in the town were struggling as to why I was going to get the opportunity to do this solar project. And yet they were sort of blowing past the issue of what the economics are of trying to be a farmer in Maine today. So that's some of the, I'll call it the back story of how I arrived at trying to do this. We took out about a 45-acre piece. Frankly, it was a little bit of a combination of cornfield, apple orchard, and a little bit of forest. So it was, I'll call it, some level of mixed use. And frankly, at any point in time, and the orchard person who uses my land could have shown up at any point in time and said, well, you know, those are older trees. We're never going to harvest on those, you know, next year. And the economic value of those trees would have gone tomorrow. So, so it made sense to take out a small portion of this mixed use of land and then use it for the remainder of keeping the rest of the property open. So my goal, and I was explaining this to Julie, that, you know, I spent a lot of time in terms of the contract that we developed. And the most important part that I put forth was that at the end of this project, the developer will have to recover all of the land to its agricultural use. So my view on it is that, you know, in 20 years, 40 years, I'm hopeful that that land will be recovered and used for other agricultural purposes. I don't know that in 40 years it will be growing growing corn or apples or trees. It might be something completely different. But it was a way to maintain that, for me to maintain that control of the land through that lease structure, and hope that in the future, as agricultural practices change or support for local agricultural practices change, that then that land can be brought back into use at an agricultural level. And it might be for a different use. Maybe it's going to be growing, I don't know, chestnut trees so that there are truffles growing in the state of Maine. But that was my goal. So I worked hard to make sure that from a decommissioning structure that I understood it and understood the costs, and that those costs were represented both in a bond issue, and that bond is required by the town of Monmouth, and if not, we would have demanded it ourselves. They have to review that and present to me every 5 years that they have enough money, whether it be in a bond or set aside, to do that reclamation and put it back into agricultural use. So I spent a lot of time in terms of the lease. I think that I'll be honest and say I'm not sure that most farmers, and I'll use my uncle as the example. I'm not sure that he would have had the time to take away from the rest of what he's doing on a daily basis to try to keep the farm running, to focus on what those business issues would have been. So I think support for the farmers to get the proper resources and consultation to make sure that they're not being taken advantage of, and that they're having the ability to maintain that land, I think would be helpful. But you know, I spent a lot of time in terms of understanding it. I spent a lot of time making sure that it was economically important to take that land out and for the right reasons. And you know, so that's the goal. And you know, and we did a lot of the same tax stuff that that Drew brought up in terms of I put the onus of the majority of those taxes back onto the developer, so that in essence the basis underlying, and it may not be a legislative, and I think maybe it was George who brought it up. In essence, I created that same structure of the underlying basis for taxation for me, I'll say for the farm, is that it's the agricultural cost structure. We didn't accept any of that from a business model. We put it back on the developer. They have to pay all of the excess taxes above and beyond what this land use was prior to it going in. So, you know, that's my experience. I think my business experience helped me work my way through some of those things. And again, I'm not sure that on a daily basis, I'll call it a traditional farmer would have that experience or time to work through all of those without getting caught and being surprised at the end of the day and being disappointed. But I love all of the stuff that Drew presented, and I think it's great. And but I'm open for any questions from the team in terms of if they want to learn more about, you know, what we did and the reasons why.
Thank you so much. That's great. Thank you, Rick. Are there questions from the group or comments about his experience? Caitlin, go ahead, and then Eliza, and then Ellen.
Thanks so much, Rick, for sharing your experience and talking with us today. I just had one question about kind of what you're looking at moving forward with this solar project. A lot of times we hear that folks are afraid that even if there's a decommissioning plan in place, that the farmer or the landowner at the time of that solar project ending its life would choose to like build a new solar project or update the panels or something like that. And I was just wondering if you see that as a reality for you, or how you think about that possibility in the future.
So, you know, so the lease that I gave to the developer, it's a 20-year lease, and I think they have 4 or 5-year extensions that they could. So, you know, so in reality, that lease, but the lease as it exists today could go on for 40 years. I'm 55. Maybe I'll be around to see the end of it, but you know, I'm sure my wife would tell you that if I don't start getting some jogging in, then I'm not going to be around to see the end of that lease. So, you know, I'll be honest and say that I'm hopeful that at the end of that 40 years that somebody would like to put up solar panels. So I'll even go, so let me go in, I mean, another partial, all of those 5-year extensions that I put in place, actually, the economic value is the greater of what the, I'll call it the fair market value of those land leases is at the time, and it can be no less than what the existing economic value is at that extension point. So I guess I would almost say, if I were to project out in 40 years and they said, well, we can put on new solar panels and here's the economic value, if that infrastructure allowed that, I guess I would say I'm all for it, because I haven't yet seen what that economic change on the pure agricultural front lends itself to. So the best way to, again, protect the other 960 acres is to have an economic value that can fund that.
Yeah.
So I'm not, it doesn't bother me if it got extended, you know, 40 years after the 40 years, because then truly there'd be 960 acres that got conserved. It didn't get conserved. It won't have gotten conserved by, you know, farmland trust or, you know, land trust or anything else. I guess to a certain extent, and maybe, and this may not be, I'll be honest and say, maybe this isn't the most efficient thing, but I've spoken to those other groups in the past, and there was no way I was going to get enough economic value to keep the farm running. So in essence, I've created my own mechanism for potentially protecting this land into a long-term pattern.
Eliza.
Thanks, Judy, and thanks, Rick. I really appreciate you sharing your experience. And I recall the project in particular. You know, Maine Audubon took a closer look at it, and it ticked all the right boxes. You know, from a wildlife conservation perspective, it's a really excellent project. And I remember being really frustrated, and you alluded to this, by the pushback from the town. And I'm, you know, continuously thinking about how how we, and I don't know who that we is, can better tell the story that you just told about how developing the solar project was part of a much larger plan to preserve something that is, elemental to the character of that town, and was in the best interest of keeping the rest of your property in agriculture. And you've talked about how you developed a decommissioning plan, and I'm wondering if that gave assurances to the town decision makers, and if you have any other insight on other assurance mechanisms, I guess, that would have helped to get them to understand the bigger picture of the project. You've talked about decommissioning. You just alluded to conservation. I wonder if an easement had been on those other projects, if that would have been enough to kind of flip the switch for the folks at the town. Any other things that you feel like would have really kind of more readily gotten the town on board with this project?
So I think, this is my view, and, this may not be fair. And I think I saw Andy's face on the Zoom as well. He probably has he may have some of the same perspective as me, but he may have a different perspective. So look, at the end of the day, I think that the site as we chose it may be one of the lowest trafficked roads in the area of Monmouth. I'm having done other building development and stuff. Of course, you always have neighbors that are disappointed, right? Is probably the easiest way to phrase it. But at the end of the day, they wanted to pass a moratorium that if they'd been honest with themselves, they would have just come out and said, we're passing a moratorium that is almost exclusively to prevent Rick Dyer from developing this site. And not to bore you with the details, but they started out with this moratorium being, we're taking away all solar development. And then, of course, the people in town said, well, wait, that means I can't put it on my house. Well, okay, they added that back. Oh, well, now I can't put it on my garage. Well, but, so at the end of the day, they should have just been honest and said, all we care about is creating a moratorium that prevents your project from going forward. And of course, I'm sure they didn't appreciate my humor in it by always challenging that. Now, at the end of the day, with some effort on my part and the developer's part of educating the town, I think we got to the right conclusion of this will be good for the town. But the threat of them being successful of creating that moratorium, I'll say was stressful. And frankly, what it meant was that there was a small group of people who had enough power on the select board to influence whether that moratorium moved forward. I don't think that they were being honest with the rest of the town in terms of why they wanted that moratorium or why they were against the project. Luckily, I think that there were enough town people who stepped forward during the vote on the moratorium to say, look, we're going to let this go forward because we think it's important for the town. And now, I don't think that they necessarily understood all of the economics of, hey, if I get to do this on these 40 acres, then I can protect the other 960. Maybe I should have been more upfront about that. But I think it turned into a risk that unfortunately weighed over the project for you know, for, you know, probably 6 months, which, you know, both slowed it down and frankly, and I'll say it in this way, it took away any attention that I would have had towards, you know, say, working with a company like Drew's company to come in and go, how can we do this even better? We were just struggling to make sure that the project got approved. Forget how could we do it better. So I think that was the risk.
I think what I'm going to suggest is that we try to take Ellen, Matt, and George's questions as quickly as possible, and then move on to the next agenda item so that we stay largely on track with the meeting. So Ellen, why don't you go ahead?
Great. Hopefully this will be a quick question. Thank you again, Rick, for sharing information about your project. I was just curious, and maybe you don't know this yet, but whether you mentioned how you sort of built into your contract that any taxes above what you were, you know, paying previously would be, you know, would be paid by the developer you were working with. But I was wondering if you have seen tax changes, whether the project is far enough along that you have actually seen changes in your tax rate.
So, I'll say that I'll answer two parts. One, and this will be quick, and I know I'm long-winded, so I apologize. But so the short answer is yes. The moment that it got approved, then they sent me the removal from ag on those acres, and so that was a tax bill that again instantly happened. I just last, or I think it was last week, paid the taxes on that property. They had not gone up for, you know, and they sent the bill for both October and April of next year. It had not moved up yet, but we're not far along in terms of a lot of equipment, you know, the solar equipment being installed yet. So probably I would think it'll happen next year. I'll be honest and say that I was surprised that they hadn't yet bumped it up on this tax bill, but they hadn't yet captured it.
Right. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, hey, Rick. Just wanted to, I don't know if I'm frozen, but just wanted to thank you for being a great partner on the project. And, you know, I think one of the things I want to just highlight was the way that you kind of thought about the broader parcel. And sort of, I think when we started to lay the project out and your understanding of not only the economics, but also just deer yards and orchard use and how all of those factors would play into sort of a, like you said in the beginning, sort of as a long-term steward of this bigger piece of property. And so, you know, that's what has been in this relationship with you has been in the back of my mind throughout this participating in this stakeholder group. So I think it's that relationship with farmers and with people who are thoughtful and have that long-term view. We need your voice, right? As part of this. This is, as opposed to kind of always thinking about it as how we can re-regulate or steer. We need the farmer-centric view, I think. And that will guide us the best in this discussion. So really appreciate it. I also just want to thank Maine Audubon for their participation in the project. It made it a better project. We we have, I don't know, probably $50,000 worth of native plants sitting out there going in the ground as part of our native plant buffer. And we're talking about doing some grazing stuff with Rick, so we can make it a better, I think, a better story for ag ongoing, talking with Andy and others. So anyway, just wanted to make the connection and thank you for participating.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you, Matt. George, go right ahead.
Yeah, so real quick, maybe some context. And Rick, I am actually very aware of your project for a couple of reasons of my own. But you know, sometimes when your abutters are also elected officials, things can get very, very complicated very, very quickly. So I just wanted to put that out there for the group.
George, that's the nicest way to say it.
Right. So, and I think it's important for the group's understanding of context and why you had as much difficulty as you did with the town. Quickly, Rick, and just because I have a follow-on question, was this DEP permitted?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, because you're over 20 acres, right?
Yep.
Okay, so this is also a really good example for the group of understanding that DEP requires a decommissioning bond from the solar developer. So the Monmouth ordinance requiring an additional performance bond is certainly, in my opinion, redundant to the DEP bond. So right now, this project now has 2 performance bonds on it, not just 1. In Rumford, we waive a performance bond, and we have a separate process for anything that's 20 acres or more that's DEP permitted and has decommissioning on it. We don't require another performance bond at all. So I wanted to take note of that, and also take note of the fact that some towns will require 150% performance bond, which in my opinion, quite frankly, borders on punitive to some of these projects. And the last thing I would say on tax treatment, because Rick came back to that, my suggestion on tax treatment is not only current use in the land itself, but I think there should be a way that we can, especially on dual use agrivoltaics, there should be a way that we can look at solar panels as integrated as part of the farm operations, especially when you have crops or feed or pollinators or whatever you're doing. If you're doing real dual use, I think we need to. I think we should take this conversation a little further on how we handle the tax treatment. So, Rick, thank you for sticking with it, and best of luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments, Rick, and to everyone else for great questions. I think what we will do is, and Rick, you're welcome to stay on as long as you like, if it's of interest to you, and no obligation otherwise. But
I think I'll drop off because
Yeah.
people have been lining up outside my office. So I think
Sure.
it's time for me to go check on other stuff. But thank you guys for your effort. And certainly if anybody has questions, you can reach out to me. I'm happy to answer anything.
Great, thank you.
All right. Thanks. Take care. Bye.
So let us pivot to, and I'm going to ask Caitlin if you might summarize for the group the additional changes that were made to the matrix. I might suggest as well, since we're looking at how we pull these things into a final report, that I think we're going to ultimately need to tweak the purpose statement to have it be not specific to the group, and have a title to this, because we've been calling it the matrix, but I think it would be helpful to just be clearer about what this is. So any thoughts about that from all of you as we're talking about this would be, I think, quite helpful to Ethan and Tom, who will be doing the first draft of the report. So go ahead, Caitlin.
Sure, thanks, Jody. And if everyone wants to take a look at the matrix on page 6 of the packet, I just made a few clerical changes based on our discussion last time. So I'll just outline those and let me know if you have any questions or objections. The first is in the matrix itself, under the non-agricultural land and farm infrastructure. I changed that
Excuse
title.
me for a minute. Sorry, Caitlin. Could somebody just pull this up? It'd be a lot easier if we could pull it up and take a look at it rather than verbally describing.
I'm trying not to, so that I can see everybody's face. Do you not have access to the packet?
I do, and then I'm just toggling between screens. I guess.
Because I don't think you need to see everybody's face, but I think it would be helpful from a facilitative standpoint to be able to. Let's keep going. And if you are running into a problem, Jeremy, speak up again, please. But go ahead, Caitlin.
I'll just be as clear as possible. So the first change that I just wanted to mention is in the matrix itself, right on the bottom where it says non-agricultural land and farm infrastructure, we had decided to just specify that it was land and infrastructure in that category. The next change is in the definitions. Under the definition of actively farmed, we wanted to specify, using the third sentence here, that actively farmed includes cropland that is used for cover crops or soil improvement, cropland on which all crops failed or were abandoned, and cropland in summer fallow. So recognizing that those are active agricultural uses as part of, normal farming practices. The next change, and actually the last change, is in the inactive farmland and other farmland definitions, just clarifying that those are basically, if we're not falling into actively farmed, just clarifying what those categories mean and being more clear that it's probably wasteland or marginal land that's part of a larger farm operation and is not being actively farmed as is defined above. So any questions or clarifications, happy to take them. But like I said, this is kind of the list of changes that we agreed upon last time. So hopefully that works for folks.
Any questions that folks have about those changes or concerns?
So just to be clear, we're talking about changes that have been made to the matrix, but they're not reflected in the packet that was distributed. Is that correct?
They are reflected in the
This
packet.
is the final version. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm looking at the packet on my other screen right now. And as of what we were sent for this meeting, that doesn't include the language that was just mentioned. Is that, I'm just trying to make sure I understand that that's correct.
What seems inconsistent, just so that we can hone in on what seems not aligned?
I was trying to follow along one box at a time to what she was mentioning as far as bullet points. And it looked, my understanding of what, Caitlin, what you were saying is that you had done a clerical cleanup on one or two boxes. And I couldn't find exactly which box that had occurred in.
Most of the changes were actually in the definitions below the actual matrix. The
Okay.
only change within the matrix was just the heading of non-agricultural land and farm infrastructure. So none of the light blue boxes changed since last time.
Ellen, go ahead.
Thanks, Caitlin, for making the clarifications. I just wanted to make sure, ask a question to make sure I understand. Under other farmland, within the parentheses where it says, but may include land used for pasture, grazing, or crops, what land would that be that doesn't fall either within inactive farmland or actively farmed? I'm just trying to get a sense of that.
Yeah, I can't think of a case of what that would be. It's just in the USDA definition. And I had just changed that to say it does not otherwise fall into actively farmland, and then kind of made that the last point in the parentheses. So it's just clear what we're talking about first and foremost. But I don't think it's a problem if we just take out but may include, if that's easier for everyone.
Would that be clearer for folks if we did?
Wondering if there's some kind of technical issue here with the differences between crossover on federal definitions and state definitions on this. I'm curious what people think about that. Sorry to jump right in.
No worries. Well, why don't we take these two points? They're related points, but let's take them separately. Would anybody have difficulty with the last phrase of the definition of other farmland being deleted? So we delete from the word but on. Emily, go ahead.
I think that I'm actually thinking that would improve it if we removed the but may include, because I think some of the confusion here might be around abandoned, not in use, but crop or pasture. And I think that is included in inactive farmland. Keeping that piece in other farmland, I think confuses where that abandoned or not in use crop and pasture land might be. So if we remove it, I think that helps clarify that the other farmland is really not anywhere where we're likely to actually have production. Putting it in there, keeping it in there, I think just confuses those two
we may want to expand upon the inactive farmland, just to clarify that this means that it could be other, the other than harvested cropland and other pasture or other pasture and grazing land. We may just want to somehow put in there that so it just has not been in use or has been abandoned or has been laid fallow, something to just help clarify that a little bit and remove that piece from the other farmland.
Does that make sense to folks? I'm seeing a lot of head nods. Caitlin, are you comfortable with how that might be done to make that addition to inactive farmland?
Emily, would you mind just adding a sentence?
Yeah, I'll
okay. So Emily,
I'll
to
pull through
add
the other definitions around abandoned and see what I can stick into that phrase for inactive farmland.
Okay, so we're making an addition to inactive, we're making a deletion to other farmland. Any other suggestions to modifications to the matrix? Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, just a quick question. I'm trying to distinguish between inactive farming and woodlot. So say it's woodlot that is in prime farmland, but it's not, like, what is the definition of inactive, I guess? And I was trying to determine that from this document, because it does seem like that could be sort of an overlap area where it's inactive because it hasn't been prepared to be in farming or considered to be in farming. I just want to make sure there's no confusion, because I think farmers do want to use those areas for solar, or at least in my experience.
Reactions to that?
I think we can make that clarification. How inactive farmland is really is if it's left for a long time, it can become a woodlot, right? But we're sort of like in that in-between stage where it has been taken out of use for whatever reason, whether it's because operationally it can't afford to produce there, it's unneeded, it needs to be fallow, and that should be separate from woodlands. That's something that I can suggest some changes between now and next meeting.
Okay, so you'd be covering that in the further clarification of the definition of inactive farmland at the bottom of the table. I mean, at the bottom.
So that woodland is really separate as woodlands.
Okay, all right. So Caitlin, I'm sorry, Selena.
Hi. One question I'm struggling with is, I think that in the sense this is helpful to see from an aspirational standpoint how we want to best manage this land. That makes sense. I wonder how to square this with what we heard from the last speaker in terms of wanting flexibility to find solutions that are economically viable to protect other farmland that they have, and how we incorporate that into this matrix to recognize that it may actually help secure farmland in the future too, or whatever decision making they might have, whether that's appropriate or not in this exercise. I'm just curious whether people have thoughts on that.
Yeah, George, I may hold your point for a moment if it's not about that. So reactions to that, Selena's point from others? Ellen and then Matt.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, I think we don't know, at least I missed it. Maybe Rick said it and I just missed it, but the 45 acres that he took out of production, do we know what soils were there?
That would have been good to know, but no, I don't think we do.
Because it may be that actually it falls within these delineations.
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah. So that was actually, oh, go ahead, sir. Go ahead, Andy,
Oh, well, too. So
go right ahead.
A lot of it is Paxton, Charlton, Sandy loam is my understanding from the soil maps anyway. So which is that prime soil, but I think some of it also has so much slope on it that it's not classified as prime. Is that right, Matt?
Yeah, I think that's right. And we can just produce a map and do a site visit for that matter, if folks are interested. But it's corn crop basically. And then as you roll down the hill, it was kind of inactive farmland and then kind of tucked into a little bit of woodland. But again, we were trying to stay away from some deer wintering yards and that kind of thing. But yeah, it was kind of a corn crop, combination of corn crop and orchard, and what the designation was, I don't know precisely in what area was designated what, but I can produce a map.
Okay, so just, I want to make sure, Ellen, that you're finishing your thought if you wanted to sort of extrapolate from that or not. And if not, then I'll take George.
Well, I just think generally, right? I mean, I think that type of setup is great, right? Where we would hope that we could sort of use an area of a farm that for whatever reason is not sort of the best agricultural resource, and sort of, if we're not doing a dual use project, develop it in a way so that it can support the rest of the farm operations. And I think that's, in my reading of the matrix, what that the matrix is sort of driving towards is sort of, when we're talking about the best agricultural resources, let's think about dual use projects or steering development towards other parts of a farm property so that we don't, it doesn't result in the loss of some of the state's limited best agricultural resources, but it can be, we can develop a part of a farm so that it really supports the rest of the farming operation.
George, and then Matt, no, Andy, you're good, or did you? Okay, George, Matt, then Andy, maybe.
So a couple things. One of my concerns on this right now is we're potentially making a departure from federal definitions, which I think is, from a technical standpoint, potentially problematic. I'm worried about what we're doing with this matrix, where we have federal definitions on something, and now we're going to drop them. And we have federal definitions on other stuff like soils. And so, like, I just feel that it's very important that we stick to federal definitions or state definitions. Whatever we're using, we stick to established definitions. So I don't think we're about to go down that path, but I'm just throwing it out there that it sort of feels momentarily like we might be. Second thing is changes to the other versus inactive categorization also seem to imply some changes to development. And then the third thing is, I think this moment really illustrates sort of the trouble that we're in with using a soils-based approach to this opportunity, which is, we just had a family farmer come on and say, I had marginal orchard and marginal grazing and some woodlot, and I drew some lines and made it work. And the soil science side is coming in and saying, well, maybe that wasn't the best thing, or maybe it should have been different. And this guy knows his land, like he knows his land and he knows his crops and he knows what he's doing. And the implication right now is that maybe if we had looked at this from a soil science point of view, he would have been told to do something different. And I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong. I think he knows, like, he's clearly committed to preserving his farm and preserving his land, and he's finding the best deal that he can. And he's gotten a lot of pressure from a lot of different places not to do this. And I do not want to put family farmers like Rick in the position where somebody's going to look at their soils and say, well, this is really good soil, so you shouldn't do it here. I'm really worried that's what we're setting these people up for. I mean, an orchard that is actively farmed. Under this matrix, we would have told him you really should co-locate this and do dual use as opposed to whatever he's going to do now, and whether or not that's even considered dual use. So I think this is a very important moment for us to recognize sort of the challenges that these approaches are producing.
Thank you, George. Matt, go right ahead.
Great, thank you. Yeah, same kind of sentiment, but I just wanted to come at it from a slightly different angle, which is that, and maybe borrowing from Drew's earlier presentation, like, I think the objective is to help, right, to achieve the goods on Drew's slide, right, all those good things. So how do we get to that? Like, I'm reminded that was a good slide, it was a great presentation, and to me it speaks to exactly what Rick was saying, which is, I'm trying to protect 960 acres by creating the maximum economic opportunity for the farm on 45 acres. if we take that away from Rick, he doesn't get to do the good thing, the big good thing, which is the 960. So if you give the private entrepreneur the opportunity to maximize the economic opportunity, that person gets the opportunity to kind of do other good things. If you sort of do the top-down approach, you could run into what George is talking about, which is you're basically taking the economic arrow out of the quiver of the farmer, which is exactly what we're trying not to do. What we're trying to do is add an arrow to the quiver and achieve economic and social goods at the same time. So we got to be very careful. I agree. This is a moment of real tension, I think, in terms of how will this matrix be used? And I would keep coming back to that. It's a very risky proposition to put something out there like this. So I think we should revisit it on the basis of what we learned today. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just make sure that we're all working on the same understanding, and we may not be, but what I was understanding that you were creating was a tool to encourage certain things, not to prohibit activity. So nowhere on this page does it say solar development would be prohibited on prime farmland. So I just, and it may very well be, you all know that, and some of you are nonetheless concerned, but I just want to make sure that we're not mischaracterizing what this says as we talk about it. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We're talking about encouraging or discouraging, not absolutely prohibiting. I also just wanted to make the point, as the other dairy farmer in Monmouth, that, it's not that not only is this matrix saying that there was no other way, if we drafted policies to encourage or discourage development on prime farmland soil, that Rick wouldn't have been able to do this project. I mean, you literally could take basically the exact same project that I see from my house right now and throw sheep in there to manage the vegetation. And I think a lot of us would consider that co-location or dual use, right? So not at no change to the economics to Rick, the economic benefit of preserving the farm or anything like that. So I guess I just wanted to make that point. And I also just wanted to say, another way perhaps of looking at a broader thought of dual use is, Rick, it's been brought up a few times, I think, that well, should we look at it, okay, if we are to develop these prime farmland soils, do we want to consider, another type of dual use is saying, well, if you're going to develop 45 acres here, should we put 45 acres over there in a conservation easement and still counts as dual use? I just think there are other ways around this, that could still achieve the same effect. That's all.
Thank you. Emily, go right ahead, then Julianne, then Jeremy, and then I'm going to suggest that we sort of take a reading on where we're at.
I think I would like to sort of build upon the sentiment that what we're doing here is not regulating one over the other, as you either can have A or you can have nothing. What we're looking at is, so if that was Paxton soils are prime soils unless it's like crazy steep and rocky. So what our matrix here is basically saying is these are productive soils. You can do both. You should look at the option you have here to evaluate, can you do both? Is that something that is worth looking, further into to protect this farmland for production while you're also putting solar on site? It's not, you cannot have solar because these are productive soils, or these are statewide important soils, or they're nothing, but they're not designated, but as a farmer, they're productive, or they say they're prime and they're relatively not productive. Like we're trying to put another point of evaluation in place that says there's more that you can do here to get at multiple goals that the state has around farmland protection, around food production, agricultural economy, clean energy goals. so, there's not, the way we have this worded, there's not a lot of teeth in this matrix. It's really just a stop and a reevaluation of these different situations. And I would encourage us to try to make sure that we can come to some added discussion and some sort of hopefully level of agreement where we see that this is about nuance and it's not about taking away avenues of siting, removing them from the options. It's about, is there an option here for something better than just clean energy? Is there an option here for something better than just food production where we can do both?
Great, thank you. Julianne and then Jeremy.
I think one element that has been missing from our conversation is that the average age of the farmer in Maine is 57. So if we're going to start pressuring farmers to do dual use projects to completely change how they are farming, it is not as simple as let's throw some sheep under these solar projects. To do that, if you'd like to see a really hilarious example of how that will fail, Jeremy Clarkson has a very funny show on Netflix about his farm. And he tried exactly that. He said, okay, well, I'll just put some sheep here and be able to make money. And he lost a ton of money. He's in a position to be able to do that. The majority of family farms in Maine are not. So this is not as simple as, oh, we can just grow some more tomatoes, or we can throw some sheep under there, or dual use is as simple as. It is not a simple project. And it would be incredibly difficult for many of these farmers to completely change how they have done things for the majority of their lives, given their ages. There's a challenge for farmers to say, okay, how much more am I going to invest in my farm versus how can I protect my farm with a project like solar or wind or some other aspect. So I think that's an important consideration, that these farmers are primarily older, and how much can we expect of them as we are examining how these projects will develop.
Thank you. Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Julie and Matt said. I mean, I'm perpetually going to try and bring us back into the realm of what does this actually turn into in the form of legislation and potentially regulation. I have no idea what this matrix is intended to communicate or convey to permitting agencies. Until and unless I can see a real life example and scenario of how this is going to play out and whether it is or isn't going to impact permitting decisions, I'm really uncomfortable with it potentially being used as such. I've been a part of stakeholder groups like this in the past where people tell me, don't worry, it's not going to have the force of law, it won't end up in a guidance document. And invariably you start seeing it in permitting conversations, whether it's the permittee, whether it's interveners in a permitting process. So I'm really concerned that I still don't feel like I understand how this is going to be used. It's being presented as, well, this is information for the Agriculture Committee to consider. Okay, assuming that's true, then what? This is fundamentally going to end up in a citing consideration and conversation. And I don't feel like we're having that conversation here as part of this group.
Okay, thank you. Are you all, not to put all of you on the spot, but are you comfortable taking a comment from Drew? Okay, yeah, I'm seeing nods. Go ahead, Drew.
Julianne and Jeremy, I think your points are incredibly important and complementary and spot on. Just to play out like a worst case scenario, there's a requirement you got to be dual use in a rural area. There's no farmer to actually back that requirement up. What does that mean? Can a project get built? Is it fall out of compliance? Rural towns, population density, right? There might not be many farmers in the area that want to sign up for this, which I think, again, sort of underscores two things, like the value of a sort of voluntary mindset, like where it makes sense and when it makes sense, let's make it happen. And then to your point, Julianne, about labor constraints, I think this is a fantastic opportunity for the school system, right? Like agricultural vocational schools, like to the extent that like there are solar projects close enough to any of those resources. What does a partnership look like when you're actually building a pipeline of new and emerging farmers? then those labor constraints in that specific area could be alleviated. And there are a ton of organizations around Maine with that express goal in mind. And I think if people can rally around even a select number of projects that want to help address that specific pain point, then maybe 5-10 years, once you've built out a labor supply, then maybe there are different approaches that are not available to everyone today based on these constraints. So just want to make that one point.
Thank you. Let me make a suggestion, and if you all disagree with it, we can keep on with this conversation, but I want to look at the rest of the agenda. I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to dig into the further details in the policy tools, priorities matrix or table. I'm going to call it a table instead of a matrix. So one possibility is to put this conversation aside for a moment, take public comment, take a really quick break, move on to the policy tools priorities discussion so that we can get a read on how many of you, how excited you are about the top 5, any of the top 5 or all, any of the tools listed in that document. And then we, at the very end, circle back to, well, then what do we do with the matrix? That would be my suggestion, given the timing. I know there are hands up, but I think that may be the way to go. Major objections to that approach? Okay. All right, then let's do that. Let's see if there are public comments of any kind, folks that are on the line. If you're interested in addressing the stakeholder group, please raise your hand. Lisa, go right ahead. And then Richard. Are you able to, let's see, it might require a, we're not hearing you yet. And it may be that Ethan needs to promote you to something.
Yep, Lisa, it looks like you're now on the panel. If you want to unmute and potentially turn on your video.
Sorry, I missed that little bit. I sit on the local planning board in Gardner, and there's new solar ordinances coming up that are being developed, and most of those are around heights of the panels and can people see it from residences. And I know that there's some pushback from the solar installation in Augusta near Route 3. It seems like the stuff that Drew presented was fabulous, and that German illustration that you had of the high panels with the cows underneath and the cars underneath. It seems like if you could package something to the town so that as they're developing their ordinances, they could consider these other uses and these things that go beyond, can your neighbors see the farm, the solar farm?
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Richard Dunham, if you're able to connect. I'll give you a second. And we're going to lose Matt in a moment if we haven't already. But if we can elevate Richard to a presenter, I think he's there now. Yeah, Richard, I think we can hear you if you want to go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Great discussion. I'm going to try to be succinct in my comments. First time listening to your group. Listening to Rick talk, I think I could speak exactly for Rick, and I'm hoping that in a year from now, I'm not going through the pain that he has on his path. I'm the largest landowner in a 35 megawatt that's soon to go public. So I'm starting on a process that Rick has gone through already. And I believe that things are developing so fast that Rick is in the category of the recent past painful approach to doing this. I'm going to be in the middle ground. And in the future, the work that Drew and other companies are doing is going to be the norm, that this is going to be so many win-wins that there won't be any question at the local levels. So I'm going to ask the group, please not be so, I'm looking for more involvement to make sure that the stakeholder groups are supporting the municipalities and the concerned citizens so that the win-wins get out there. Because even everyone thinks that this is a worthwhile endeavor, whenever I talk to somebody about it, their initial inclination is to be anti the solar project until I start talking about what I would call the 21 wins, and there might be 1 or 2 minor losses to the whole thing. So things I'm interested in the near term are that there aren't any barriers before we get to the path where Drew and I believe most of these solar developers come at this from not just a profit motive, but I think they also like their business, that it's good for the environment and everyone concerned. So until we get to that point, I'm looking for a lot of involvement so that maybe the Audubon, Maine Farm Bureau, respected organizations aren't sitting back, but taking an active role in promoting this so that the public relations kind of can keep up. I'd like to make one more point, is that I'm unique in that my land is going to be gone from forest land to solar. And I consider this a preservation strategy that we need to go after. And everything everybody's been saying rings true with me. I know I'm going to get a lot of pushback that this is cutting down forest land, but somebody was just talking about what is inactive farmland. All of Maine is inactive farmland. My forest land is inactive farmland. The stone walls and the cellar holes will tell you that that was an active farm and that was fields 120 years ago. I know I'm going to get pushback that this is old growth forest, but it's really farmland. So me, as in Rick's shoes, my daughter's going to see the end of this, but really it's a little snapshot in time that these solar panels might be here. You know, we don't know what the energy production is going to be 100 years from now, but it's probably not even going to be solar. So I think this is all kind of, I'm sorry, just give me a couple more seconds here. We talk like this solar is taking it out of farmland forever and ever, but really this is just a preservation moment in time. What I'm planning on doing is going the easement route so that my future generations, this is going to be, and I'm hoping that the local land trust will get behind this, in that I'm going to make it in perpetuity to be used only for agricultural and forest. And I might even just go agricultural because I'd like to see it come back to the town. So at the end of the decommissioning, I'm hoping that this is going to be better soil for pasture or for planting than it was 120 years ago. And I'm hoping that this path will bring back maybe 80 acres of farmland that used to be used in my town and isn't today. So I'm really looking at all of the incentives that the local and state agencies can throw towards this. I'm looking for more active involvement when there's concern from local citizens. I love the fact, I think it was George talking about the tax base. You know, I want to see my land go into some kind of agricultural use. My developer would really like to go the dual use. We've talked about sheep grazing, but frankly, the DEP kind of put them on their heels. So I want to make sure that they're in the near term, there isn't any barriers there. Also, that there's no, you know, wanting it all type of a process when we have to have a few trade-offs, because I've heard wildlife fences. Yeah, that's fine, but it kind of throws the sheep farming out if you want to have a pass through, which I kind of find it's kind of a little silly. I kind of think it's Wile E. Coyote on Blazing Saddles coming into the middle of the prairie and hitting a fence. I think you'll Wile E. Coyote will go around. So anyway, just throwing all of this out there, I want to reach out to Rick and a couple other people on this for some guidance, but I'm about to dive into a pretty major project, and we're going to see if I have the Rick experience or a better experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really helpful to hear. I think we should go on break. It's 11:07 by my computer. If we could be back at 11:12, 5 minutes from now, and we're going to jump right into the policy tools document in your packet. All right, thank you. Hello.
Hi there. I think I'd like to do a little research on these USDA definitions of other agriculture. My experience with the Ag Census is that it's a fairly lengthy and complex list of definitions. I'm not seeing them match up completely with what we have in this matrix.
Maybe you could follow up with Emily directly, who has been tasked with making those changes.
Okay.
That would be great.
Yep.
I just hopped on to hear that, Tom. I'm happy to chat with you about that.
Okay. Yeah, I spend
I do heard that. That's great.
too much of my life looking at the appendices of the Ag Census.
Yeah, they're cavernous.
Yeah, they are. I noticed the link was to Appendix B and I was looking at Appendix A. So slight variations there.
All right, we are at 5 minutes exactly with 3 of us. There we go. 4, 5. Okay. Let's see our list. Nancy. Eliza, Patrick, Emily, Ellen. I know we had Caitlin, so I'm going to assume we still do. Just looking for a few other folks to join before we start. Hey, Andy. George. Patrick. Do we still have Fortunate with us? So if all of you who are still here could just turn on your cameras briefly so that even if you're not wanting your camera on, I know that you're back with us and hearing. Okay. All right. Well, let's carry on. And what I think I'd like to suggest is, given the time that we have available, I'm always going to assume that the whole stakeholder group has read the packet fully. So I don't think it makes sense to spend time even with a brief kind of summary of each of these items on the policy tools spreadsheet. What I'd like to do is take them one at a time. So we'll be talking briefly about a dual use pilot program. You'll recall that the reason this whole document is rearranged is this rapid kind of voting exercise that we did at the end of the last meeting, saying, you know, which of these seem most exciting and most seem like they have the greatest opportunity. And so based on those votes, the top 5 are listed as the top 5. There were a couple that fell off entirely. We can circle back to them if you like, but and the final 3 in the document also received votes, just fewer than the 5. So these are sort of in order of priority, I would say, but recognizing that it was sort of a rapid exercise. So I don't want to put too much stake in the order of these. But on the dual use pilot program, you'll recall Drew mentioning that, you know, there is such a pilot going on in New Jersey right now, 200 megawatts. Just want to get general feedback from any of you about what's in here, how you might want to move this forward as a recommendation, or concerns that you have about doing that. Emily, go ahead.
I'll try to be succinct. I think this is an incredible opportunity with potential support here to have a sort of defined amount in a pilot program, a lower risk than just opening the doors to different incentives or programmatic dual use guidelines. But this provides, for those that are particularly nervous or unsure about how this would work in Maine, this provides the opportunity for real life examples. It provides a boundary around what that would contain in terms of whether we want to suggest a fixed megawatt capacity for a pilot program, X number of years. To me, this seems just like an not to prime opportunity, not in referring to the soils here, to have the space and participation to develop projects that then can be used to show increased benefit here for these, you know, not just harvesting one thing over the other, but being able to harvest multiple crops, the sunlight crop and production.
Thank you. You know, maybe the most efficient way to go about this would be if people have a concern about this one being sort of advanced as a recommendation. Any concerns that the group should be aware of? Okay. All right, then why don't we move on from that one for now and assume that that's sort of an endorsement of sorts. You'll have a chance to look at that again in a draft report and move on to current use taxation. Reactions to what you read here. And you'll also recall that each one of these 7 that are in this document were further fleshed out with tools, pros and cons, and also a little bit more thought given to land use considerations and where possible, the implementation mechanisms. So there's more detail than what you saw last month as well. Ellen, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is another important tool. You know, we've talked a lot about the taxation implications related to solar development. And I think this is a way to incentivize dual use projects without, you know, sort of having ratepayers bear the cost of that, which I know there's a lot of concerns about. I think, as some of the developers have mentioned during other conversations, it also creates consistency across towns, which can sometimes be an issue with the way that different current use taxation programs are implemented. And I think as long as, you know, I know there's some concerns with, in some municipalities about, you know, whether this would create sort of another kind of exemption when we're already putting a lot of pressure on municipal budgets. But I think the piece in here that's important is that if we make sure that the farming requirements that a farm would otherwise have to meet to enroll in current use taxation in the farmland current use taxation program are being met, then really this is just sort of, you know, other on-farm infrastructure. And so farms that are putting up dual use projects shouldn't be subject to the withdrawal penalty.
Awesome. I'm seeing a lot of head nods to what you're saying, Ellen. Andy, go right ahead.
I think Ellen said everything that I wanted to say. I just think that this is probably the most effective tool that we had, especially, you know, with there being concerns in the group about, you know, a command and control approach of any kind in terms of farmland soils. So, and as a farmer who's been approached by multiple developers and is still considering development on some of our farm, I think it makes a lot of sense. So
awesome. Great. Thank you. Patrick, go right ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say that I also like this tool. And from a municipal perspective, if we're using this tool as a way to create more projects, then there is revenue coming in the form of Betty, or better, more likely Betty, tax exemptions. So there's still municipal revenue to be gained by this.
Awesome. Okay, then unless you have major objections, I might suggest we move on to the 3rd item, permit by rule. Anything else on current use for the time being? An acknowledgement that this is being contemplated by DEP currently. I don't know if there's any new information that either co-chair or anybody else has about the status of that and ways that if this committee continues to think that this is a good idea, how it might encourage that being implemented. Thoughts on this one?
I'll just say that I don't have insight into the status of this.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps before we finalize the report, we could have a brief conversation with DEP to understand where they are in the process and how this could be timed.
Sure. Okay. So reactions to it as an approach, supportive, concerns? Andy.
I also like this approach. I think it works well in conjunction with the farmland tax adjustments and just jumping dual use projects ahead of other projects in the queue. In terms of talking with developers about a potential project on our farm, one of the challenges that we have run into is, even though we want to do a dual use project on some of our most mediocre farmland soils, now we are pretty far behind a lot of other projects in the queue. And I think understanding how permit by rule works, it kind of would help us maybe jump ahead in the queue. Is that accurate, or no, not necessarily? I'm gonna yeah.
I'm not sure how to answer that, Andy, to be honest. I don't.
Eliza?
I think queue is not quite the right word, because we're often referencing the interconnection queue, but it would mean that often a PBR would result in a faster regulatory review. So you wouldn't necessarily jump ahead, but you'd move at
I guess, right. Yeah, I think I was confusing things in my head, but yes, regardless, yeah, helping with the regulatory constraints would be a dual use project.
Just a detailed question. I wondered if in the land use considerations column, where it talks about projects that locate on or away from these areas would then meet those standards. I wasn't quite sure about the or away from, because the examples given above that in that paragraph don't talk about resources that one would locate away from. I think I just wanted to make sure that the phrasing of that was clear. If it was clear to all of you, then don't worry about the way I read it. Did that all make sense to you, the way it was worded in that column under land use considerations? Which of you wrote that? I can't remember. Eliza. Okay. Leave it as is. So then we will, in the draft report, advance this one as well. So shall we move on to substation hosting capacity mapping? So, an idea that received a lot of endorsement in the voting exercise, a major concern that has been raised around this is about grid security risks, and I just wanted to make sure that that wasn't overlooked. Caitlin.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, in context of this tool, it may not be this group's real area of expertise or an area that we have the ability to fully influence or implement. But I do think because it's part of a larger conversation and a lot of folks have been trying to make this happen for a long time, it's important for us to kind of state this as something that would help and add to the chorus of voices saying that this would be a really helpful tool in many, many aspects of solar development in Maine. So even if we don't add any more detail than that, I just think it's important for us to kind of mention that this is an important aspect.
Anybody disagree with that? Okay. All right, then I'm going to keep us moving along. Tariff program, again, received a fairly large number of endorsements at the last meeting. Reactions to that? Patrick.
Yeah, my concern is where it talks about subtractors. I don't like anything that is going to discourage. Dual use is the gold standard, but we also need just more solar in general. So I don't like including anything that discourages development.
And just to clarify, and does this feel to you like it would do that?
I feel like the subtractors would.
Not subtractor, adder.
Right, but it's
subtractor in the language there, Joe.
Sorry, did I miss something?
Yeah, it speaks to subtractors when you go through the boxes.
Oh,
I like the adders.
I think both pieces were put in there for full evaluation, but if we wanted to move forward with just the adder language, I think that that's something we could discuss.
That was my understanding of the votes from the last meeting, was that it was the interest was to speak simply to the issue of adders.
That would just mean removing a couple of those paragraphs.
Sorry, I lost track. I think we have George and then Selena.
I was just going to say that I think that this particular aspect of it, obviously the subtractors are something that seems like we have a pretty strong consensus with. It's not the intention, but even this tariff aspect is the part that is going to be, I think, divisive and problematic when you get to a statewide level consideration of this. And there's a lot to be said for the idea that this type of program may be necessary to support dual use, but I think that this is the one that's going to cause trouble. And I think that if we can find a way to advance dual use and in general support farms without having to get into commitments by utility consumers beyond maybe three-phase extension, I think that would be really positive. And I don't want to make solar appear to be a burden on the ratepayer. I want it to be an opportunity for the ratepayer.
Yeah, hear you. Selena, thanks. George.
Thanks. And to build on what George said, I think that there could be a place for adders or subtractors related to agricultural lands, and do see that this is an area worth exploring, but I think it has to be done in the context of other policy objectives in relation to siting. And so I'm concerned with this, the mechanism being specifically around legislative or regulatory steps, as opposed to, I would suggest, passing it to the DG stakeholder group for further discussion and understanding that doesn't encompass all, solar projects. I think other planning efforts that the state does around siting could be an appropriate place to put this, so that when we put forward an adder, we aren't, it's in the context of thinking about how all of the policy objectives around siting are considered in addition to agriculture.
So yeah, go ahead, Eliza.
Just in agreement with Selena that I think that behooves us to make specific reference that this should be considered by the distributed generation stakeholder group. Not in perhaps the entirety of the report, or perhaps there are ideas that can be passed along right now. I think that that's where this one in particular should get the kind of the full consideration. And I think that that group is best poised to make sure that it does not have an undue impact on ratepayers.
So which of you drafted this one? Emily. So I guess the question to the group is, would you prefer to have it removed from this table and have a standalone recommendation for the DG stakeholder process to dig into this issue, or would you like it to remain in this table with modified language that essentially says that? Preferences? Selena?
I guess I'd just say that it depends on how the table is presented. If this is the tools that are on the shelf, ready to go, future action can take, and then I think we should take it out. But if it's more like these are items that may just require more discussion, deliberation, and action, then I'm not opposed to it being in.
So why don't I suggest that Ethan and Tom keep it in the table, clarify the language that I might ask Emily if you were willing to tackle that reflects this conversation. Leave it in there for now. You'll see it in the draft in that format in modified language. And Emily, and we'll talk about the timeline for this report drafting shortly. And so any of these new pieces of information are going to be needed in a very rapid turnaround, but I don't think we're talking about big chunks of work here. Okay, so that brings us then to 6 and 7, 6, 7, and 8. increased municipal planning capacity. We heard, I think, also from farmers today about, the interest in greater technical assistance to farmers. But just wanted to get your reactions to this number 6, I'm calling it. And you'll note that you may have seen, just this very week, Dixmont put into place a temporary moratorium on solar siting. So clearly there's, need at the municipal level to understand how to address solar interests. Emily.
To me, this stands out as different from the rest because this is really something that I think, regardless of what we would want to put forward as, suggestions or recommendations around dual use, I think this is something that should happen across the board anyway. I wonder if this couldn't be discussed as not necessarily a tool that would be in the list of things to potentially choose from, but personally, overall, I think this is something that is beneficial across the board for solar, no matter the siting, whether it's on farmland or woodlots or contaminated lands. So to me, this almost seems like, personally, and coming from, AFT, this is something that is sort of overarching, that I think has value regardless of the other pieces that we would want to put forward for recommendations. Like if it's on a checkbox, this to me just seems a little more logical and something that I feel like this would be a lot of buy-in for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, other reactions to it? Does it belong here? Does it read right? Selena.
I think it's great to have something that's actionable in this list, so I'm not opposed to keeping it in. The other thing I think is we've heard about, you mentioned it, Emily, but the need for farmers to have some support too, and I don't know if that's a separate thing that we should tackle or incorporate it into this, not knowing what is involved and how how complicated that could be, but just raise that.
Mm-hmm. Who drafted this one? Eliza, and do you have a perspective on this issue of, sort of, because you even raised the question to Rick, right, Eliza, around, what could have been done to better support, the community understanding what Rick's interests were and how they played into him preserving 960 acres by developing 40. So I don't know if it's appropriate to add in anything about farmer technical assistance or support or not. I'm not trying to advocate one or another. I just want to raise the question.
I do think it would be appropriate to put in something about farming technical assistance, and I agree that I think someone said previously that keeping it in there, though I do think it's a kind of a no-brainer. I see this having usefulness in keeping it in this context. Should there be a legislative call for a new position at a particular agency or whatnot, that this is a way of saying, hey, you know what, that this group agrees that the state, for instance, could play a role in adding more technical assistance capacity on this. And so that, I think, by including it in this list helps us make that case. That doesn't mean that the state is the only place where that technical capacity can live, but it does, I think, help build the case should there be enthusiasm for that approach.
So is everybody then comfortable with Eliza, if I may, ask you to slightly expand by adding in this piece about farmer technical assistance, but keep it in the table? George and then Ellen.
I'd be supportive of this as long as it was solely within DACF. I don't support any technical assistance or planning funds going to any of the advocacy groups or organizations. I think this should be through an agency that deals directly with farmers. And I think that planning and assistance and technical money sometimes does get directed towards, non-governmental organizations, and I don't support that in this case.
Thank you, Ellen, and then Selena.
Yeah, I mean, I was under the impression this was creating a position at a state agency or, and I would say, especially if we're adding in the farmer piece, I think it would make sense to have it be the creation of a position at DACF.
Okay, thank you. Selena, and then I lost Selena.
Julie's next. I can hold my comment. I'm
Got it. Thanks, Julie. Yeah.
Thanks. I would actually prefer to see an organization like Cooperative Extension do this rather than the department. I think most farmers have an established relationship with them, and they have access to better data a lot of times because of their the experiments that they conduct. So I don't want to see this limited to the Department of Agriculture.
Thank you. Patrick, then Nancy, then Emily.
So I like farmers getting some more technical support, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that municipalities need the help. I know my experience in Hollowell, like we knew other towns had wheels out there, but we still felt like we were building our own wheel.
Great. Let's try to wrap this one up fairly quickly, Nancy and then Emily, so we can move on to the next item.
Sure. I'll just mention that the department actually does have a staff member here who is tasked with working with municipalities relative to zoning issues. Anytime that there is a proposed change to a town's zoning regulations that would impact agricultural lands, we by statute need to receive notice of that, and we can provide input to them. So I'm flagging this because we do have experience working with municipalities relative to land use issues. And so I think that there's fertile ground to explore how we can expand that with a focus on the ins and outs of solar ordinances.
Great, thank you. Emily, go ahead and then we'll wrap this up.
Thanks. Two quick things. One, I think I would love to see the language maybe detailed and strengthened. And Eliza, I'm happy to also work on that with you to really make it clear the goals of what this would be as we're discussing here. And if it's something that's going to require funding, I know that it's listed. Let's really make it clear that we're not just asking for more resources posted on a website that farmers can access, but we're talking about some more hardy technical assistance. And the second piece, I'm just going to caution because I'm acutely aware of issues that have arisen with UMass Extension in terms of capacity to be involved with support in agricultural farmland sited projects. So while I know that UMaine would certainly be able to fundamentally provide that support without providing capacity and access, that is something that could be really difficult. And if they don't have projects in the mix already, they're going to have limited access to data to support. So this isn't anything about UMaine Extension. It's about ensuring that there's capacity and resources if they are going to play, and that might be something that needs to be provided.
Yeah, got it. Selena.
Okay, very quickly, I'd just say that I think including the Governor's Energy Office in addition to DACF would be helpful in that we're doing technical assistance around energy. We're trying to invest more energy into doing that for municipalities, and so the agencies coordinating would be helpful so that it's a coordinated effort from the government.
Got it. Okay. So Eliza and Emily, do you feel like you have enough clear? Okay, perfect. Then we'll modify that accordingly. Mitigation fund in lieu fee program. It's on here. Thoughts about that? You all like it. You like the idea. Jeremy.
I apologize because I think I remember what I'm about to say, but I could be way off base on this. I have a vague recollection that we heard a little bit about this, but then quickly heard that New York hadn't actually implemented anything yet.
So New York,
am I off base on that?
You're not off base. New York's mitigation fund exists, but it's so early on that monies, I'm not sure if monies have actually been collected yet. What I do know is that even if they have been, they haven't been allocated to other projects. So they're in the process of developing the criteria by which those funds would be expended. George, if you want to add to that, that's fine, but George, go ahead.
Yeah. To be perfectly honest with you, I think it's redundant to DEP's permitting. I really just don't doesn't feel necessary. I don't think that we need to mitigate this way. I would offer this. I would offer this as maybe an alternative or something that takes into account impact and those kinds of things. In our solar ordinance here in Rumford, we require solar panels to be TCLP certified, toxicity characteristics leaching procedure certified. I think that is a meaningful certification that I think is important, and it is a deliberate, it's a twofold measure. Number one, it builds public confidence in the quality of the panels that are being installed, in our opinion. And it also is an intentional soil protection and groundwater protection measure as well. Solar panels don't necessarily have a whole lot of risk associated with them when they're installed in the US and they've been properly regulated, but TCLP certification, which is regulated by the EPA, is kind of an additive measure that I think increases public confidence in the installations and speaks towards any potential impacts. So I've been kind of wondering if there was a time or a place to bring this up. And so I'm bringing it up now, and I'm a regular advocate for it. And I think it's important.
Okay, yeah, heard. I guess let me just make sure that we don't lose sight of this item in the, I want to get clear from the group on what you're feeling about what I'm calling number 7, mitigation fund in lieu fee. Patrick, go ahead.
So I'd be interested to see how it gets flushed out a little bit more. So I'm not entirely against it, but I am concerned that this might be another example of inhibiting solar development. I think of a project like Rick's out in Monmouth, where this probably would have applied to him, making his project more expensive. And I think most of us feel like his project sounds like it was a good, sensible one. And so I don't want to make more barriers for projects like what Rick had out in Monmouth.
Yeah, got it. Jeremy, similar perspective?
Yeah, I was basically just going to say the same thing. I'm not sure what makes solar so environmentally concerning compared to other types of development here. So I would just echo what Patrick just said.
Okay, thank you. Ellen?
I was just wondering if anyone in the group is aware of mitigation funds that exist out besides the New York example, just because we understand that is in its infancy. I know Topsom, as part of their solar ordinance, actually has a mitigation fund, but they haven't used it yet. But I'm just curious if Drew or others, are aware of mitigation funds that, or Emily, that exist in other states or localities.
So why don't we, if anybody is, start writing that in the chat so we can keep moving at the same time. Nancy.
I certainly understand where folks are coming from with their concerns about this. I think it's worth leaving it in with additional modifiers, underscoring that this is still a developing area, and just qualifying it as having been looked at by this group, but the expectation being that much more needs to be done before this would be advanced as a policy recommendation or something like that.
Who wrote this one?
I did.
Ellen, does anybody object to Nancy's recommendation? Okay, are you okay about making those modifications, Ellen?
Yep, I can.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you. So we have a last one on here, and I want to make sure we get through this because I did want to circle back to, there were a few others that were on the original spreadsheet that weren't carried forward. A couple of them I think may make sense. I just want to make sure that they weren't inadvertently dropped off and that you wanted them on there. So let's just finish with the state procurement evaluation and scoring and your reactions to that. Caitlin.
Yeah, I think when we're considering these kind of like state level programs, whether it's for incentives or just capacity, I think that recognizing there's many, many steps that have to happen after we decide that we want a program like that this group should take the first step of recommending one type of program that we think would be the best for the purposes that we're discussing here. Like, we should choose between a state procurement and scoring system and like the dual use pilot program. Like, those are kind of in the same realm. And I think it's within our purview to make a decision about like the best recommendation.
Happy to get others' reactions to that. And I may be confusing things, and if I am, please let me know, but I wasn't clear whether state procurement evaluation / scoring was the same as the scorecard issue that was raised at the last meeting and sort of put aside temporarily. So if somebody could clarify that for me, that would be great. Selena, you had your hand up.
Oh, I wasn't going to answer your direct question, but I see those. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Did you have something else that you wanted to cover, and then I'd get reactions to that confusion?
Yeah, I would treat this one similarly as the adder one in terms of recommending it to the DG group, distributed generation group, so that it could be looked at in concert with other siting interests. And it is similar to the adder, but they could be combined, but they're also a little bit different. So happy to have them separate too, but it's getting at the same issue.
And so we're talking about state procurement evaluation scoring, not the previous one, the mitigation fund. Yeah. Any objections to that idea? Leave it in the table, make it as a recommendation to be given further consideration by the DG group. And Ellen, are you wanting to speak to that? Yeah, go ahead, Ellen.
I guess I'm just wondering though, I mean, given that scoring criteria would include a number of different components, right? And so given that this is the group that is focused on sort of the, combination of, or sort of the balance between solar development and agricultural resources, whether it doesn't make sense for this group to be coming up with sort of what criteria we would like to see evaluated if we're moving forward with this recommendation, because I'm not sure the membership of the DG's stakeholder group, but I'm not sure that whether there are sort of folks involved, farmers, agricultural resource organizations, DACF, that would be able to sort of bring that perspective of, what kinds of ag-related criteria should be included. So I guess that would be my concern about just passing it over to that stakeholder group.
Any thoughts about that, Selena?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point in terms of the expertise. And so in terms of timing, I think that understanding what that looks like and fleshing that out is really important. And also looking in the context of other criteria that you want the PUC to look at. So if it's a suggestion or a recommendation that either we delve into it now or that a future group delve into it, then that would be okay. I think that'd be okay, but I think it deserves a lot more discussion prior to immediately, for instance, passing legislation that includes language around scoring for agricultural purposes, in January or something.
I'll take it in just a second, Jeremy. Who created this one? As Eliza. Okay. And Patrick, sorry, Jeremy, is your point related to this one? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree with what Ellen was just saying. It's probably not a bad idea for us to suggest something. But as I'm reviewing some of the other columns, I mean, we're also, and I recognize some of this is just parroting what was in the DG procurement process, but you know, we're putting things in here like workforce development and other values held by ratepayers. I mean, that is way far outside the purview of what I think this group should be looking at. So if we wanted to give some sort of high level directional, hey, DG 2.0 group, this is something you could or may want to consider, I'm perfectly fine with that. But including all of these other things, I'm definitely not.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, Ellen, did you still have your hand up in terms of reaction or not?
Well, I guess I was just trying to think in response to Selena's point, just whether there, I totally understand that that probably is, you know, a multi-meeting conversation, right? But whether there's some way, instead of just turning it over to the DG group, to have like, you know, maybe they're orchestrating the whole process of coming up with, but that they are doing so in conference with folks who have sort of expertise in this particular area around agricultural resources and solar siting.
So what if, Eliza, if you were willing, that you modified this one, again, in somewhat similar vein to how we were handling the other one that was being recommended to the adder one, except pulling in the idea that, you know, there would need to be agricultural expertise consulted with in order to develop that specific criteria. So to develop a process in which that would happen, and then stripping the pros column from stripping from that the concern that Jeremy raised. Does that make sense to you? Does that feel like that gives you enough guidance? The rest of the group comfortable with that approach? And then you'll have a chance to look at it in draft form. Okay, all right. So again, if I'm the only one confused about this, we'll move on. But is this the same thing as the evaluation scorecard issue? I got a little lost, but there was, is that the same thing? You know, we had a whole sort of discussion about scorecards at the last meeting. There were a lot of examples provided. There was a decision at that time to sort of park it and consider raising it again at a future point. And I'm confused about it. And if the rest of you aren't, we'll move on.
In my mind, it is very similar. That, for instance, in the original distributed generation procurement that Maine PUC issued, they did have something that is akin to a scorecard. It's really a manner of evaluating particular projects. So there are, yes, a lot of similarities to a scorecard.
Okay, then what I might encourage is, as you are rewriting this, that you go back to the last month's version, the last month's meeting packet that had a separate column, it had a separate row about scorecards, and see if there's anything relevant from that language to pull in. I'm not advocating it. I just didn't, if they're basically, we're talking about the same thing, it's worth looking at that. Does that make sense? Okay, all right. So the only other ones that were not pulled forward into this version of the spreadsheet were having a state procurement process specific to dual use and co-location. That was sort of taken off the table immediately. Addressing stormwater concerns relative to grazing, and I didn't know what the status of that was and whether you still wanted that in here, or if it's moving ahead, it's going to happen anyway. I just didn't want it to get inadvertently lost. I'm sort of looking to Nancy maybe for status on that and what your thinking is on that.
I mean, I can speak to the stormwater aspects. There has been some very good movement in that arena. It is still technically sort of a pilot with the Department of Environmental Protection, but I have every belief that it will become normalized, and I think I could go either way. I think that I would need to look back and look at the original language around stormwater and see if it should be rephrased and redescribed given the forward progress we've made.
Okay.
And instead, yeah, and just and make that language reflect that, with the purpose of it sort of being an expectation of this group that solar grazing with the Department of Environmental Protection will become the norm, or something like that. Or we can just leave it out. I'm happy to do either, but as the first step, why don't I just go back and look at what we had last time?
That sounds great, unless anybody has a problem with that. All right, the last one was DACF participation in review processes, and I leave that in your court, I think, Nancy, as to whether you felt like there was adequate discussion about that, and that no longer needs to be a consideration in this table.
I don't think it needs to be, given the direction that we're going right now and the analysis today of where our preferences lie. I don't think that would be useful.
Okay. All right. So I think we're through it. Just I think we all have our tasks assigned. The issue is that from a timeline perspective, we are trying to create a draft of a first draft report, and we'll get to the outline in a moment, but a first draft report by the 4th, to be by the 4th of November. And so any, tweaking of language that could be done, by the middle of next week would be ideal, to then forward a revised table to Ethan and Tom. I see your hand up, Ellen, and so go ahead.
Sorry, I'm trying not to complicate things, but along with the recommendations related to the policy tools, I just wanted to put forward the idea that we also include a recommendation just related to having a more centralized and easily accessible location for information around solar development on farmland. So right now it's very hard to determine, as we've discussed in prior meetings, about projects that are moving forward, exactly how much farmland is impacted, exactly what soils. And I know that from conversations with others, that in other states that information is more readily available. And I think, that is just important information for us to have moving forward.
Any concerns about adding that to the table?
I don't have concerns about adding to it. I think I would like to second that. Understanding what we're looking at here in terms of impact, I think will help understand sort of some of the impetus or need to make some of these more of a priority.
Okay, great. Ellen, are you willing to draft that essentially row that would be in the table, or if it doesn't feel appropriate, a standalone recommendation?
I mean, I was sort of I guess I don't have strong feelings either way. I was sort of thinking of it as more of like it's not a policy tool. It's kind of like an overarching need. But yes, I'm happy to work on that.
Okay, great. All right. So if we could switch then please to the outline of the report that was forwarded to you by separate email a couple of days ago, and just get high-level reactions to this framework for a report. And if you had any additions or questions about this proposed layout. Okay. Well, then I think what we'll do is sort of proceed with this, in this form, and that you'll receive a draft report in the next meeting packet, which would be roughly roughly the 12th. Might be a little bit later. Ellen, did you have another issue? It's fine.
All right.
Fine.
I'm the worst. I have two questions or comments about that outline.
Yeah, go ahead.
The first was, I was just wondering where the matrix that Caitlin has been really leading the charge on, like whether we were going to describe that within the body of the report, and if so, where it would fall. Maybe I just missed it. And then I also just thought we should, under other topics, we should include dual use, because we now had like a really great presentation on that, and we should acknowledge
Right.
that.
Yeah, no, but I'm so glad you're mentioning both of those things. Ethan and Tom and I talked right before the meeting about the need to certainly add the Blue Wave presentation on dual use, whether it belongs in section 7B4 or under section 7C, but it would be in there. And then I think really, yes, the matrix was not explicitly referenced, nor were the policy options. I think that they could be and would appropriately belong in the recommendations, although I think, in light of today's conversation, the question of the matrix is still an outstanding question. So if it gets in there, it would be, most likely somewhere in the conclusions and recommendations section, but it was an omission. But in light of today's conversation, it's now a question, like, what do you want to do with that? It was a lot of work. Is there any role for it? And I think that's an issue that needs to be discussed further at the next meeting. If in the near term, between now and then, particularly, I would say, for those of you who have the greatest concerns about the matrix, if you have any particular perspective on how some of that body of work could be useful to advance, I would really like to hear from you. One option is you throw it out because it makes you too uncomfortable. The other is to acknowledge that there was a pile of work done there and it might be useful in a certain way. And so particularly for those of you who have the greatest concerns about that, I'd love to hear from you as soon as possible if you have any great ideas. And then I'm sorry, we're going over. I'm going to ask quickly attendees if they had any other thoughts, raising hands about any other public comments. Okay. And the last item I just wanted to mention is that the planning group, the co-chairs and Ethan and Tom and I have been talking about, is there a need? Is there a way to solicit public input in a draft document? So we're kind of trying to figure that out and wonder whether, making the first draft available to the public at the same time that you receive it, to give the public an opportunity to weigh in, might be the most efficient way to do that. So that's kind of what we're noodling over right now. I just didn't want to ignore that point. Anything else before we finish up? All right, thanks for sticking with it, and so appreciate everybody's input. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Jody.
Yeah, take care.